Tonight we're diving into a world that might seem romantic from a distance, but trust me, you probably won't survive this. Imagine cobblestone streets slick with rain, smoky hearths crackling in drafty halls, and people juggling love, duty and survival without Google, texting or even deodorant. Welcome to dating in medieval Europe, where every glance, every word and every stolen touch carried risks no modern swipe can match. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time below. I'm curious where in the world you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Dating in medieval Europe wasn't what you might expect. Forget about spontaneous coffee dates or swiping right. People's romantic lives were tied tightly to social status, family alliances, religious rules, and survival. For most, dating as we know it didn't exist. Instead, relationships were structured around family negotiations, community expectations, and a complex web of customs. Courtship was less about love and more about strategy, though feelings certainly found a way to sneak in. For peasants, daily life was a grind of hard work and close quarters. Meeting a potential partner meant seeing someone in the village, often through daily chores or church gatherings. Social events were rare and precious. For nobles, things looked quite different on the surface. Elaborate tournaments, grand balls, and intricate codes of conduct. But underneath, the pressure to marry well, secure alliances, and produce heirs often overshadowed genuine affection. And just to set the scene right, life expectancy was low, diseases ran rampant, and even hygiene was a challenge. Imagine trying to impress someone when the best you could do was avoid that common smell of sweat, smoke, and unwashed wool. Yet people still fell in love, flirted awkwardly, and wrote poems, sometimes in secret and always at risk. Historians still argue how much choice individuals really had in matters of love. Were people purely pawns in family games, or did they exercise agency within limited options? The answer varies widely depending on time, place, class, and individual stories. One thing is certain: love in medieval Europe was complicated, messy, and utterly human. And here's a quirky tidbit. Despite the lack of modern dating apps, people had their own signals. For example, a man might leave a glove or a ribbon at a woman's doorstep as a silent declaration of interest. No text needed, just the risk that her family might find it first. Love letters existed too, but they had to be carefully coded or smuggled by trusted messengers. Not exactly instant communication. So buckle up as we journey into a world where love meant navigating strict rules, sharp social divides, and a fair bit of awkwardness, without the safety net of Netflix or texting. Imagine a morning in a small medieval village. The sun is barely up, and smoke curls from chimneys as people begin their daily work. At the center of this tight-knit community is the church, its bells calling the faithful to worship, and often to gather. For most medieval folk, especially peasants, church was the main place, and sometimes the only place, where unmarried men and women could meet, exchange glances, and maybe even start something more. But even these encounters were tightly regulated, full of customs and unspoken rules. Unlike today's casual meetups, social interaction was structured and watched closely. Villagers understood the importance of reputation. One misstep could lead to gossip, scandal, or worse. Courtship rituals involved a delicate balance between visibility and discretion. Young men might approach a woman's family with a formal request to court, and she was expected to behave modestly, avoiding overt flirtation. Yet, within those strict boundaries, affection grew in subtle ways. Many medieval communities celebrated feast days and religious festivals, which provided rare opportunities for young people to socialize more freely. These events might include dancing, games, and communal meals, where courtship was sometimes disguised as playful competition or ritualized dance. Here, a young man might offer a token like a flower or a handkerchief to a girl, signaling interest without risking direct confrontation. Historians still argue how much agency young women had in choosing partners, while families played a significant role in arranging matches, especially for securing economic or social advantages. Evidence suggests that many young people exercised subtle forms of choice within these constraints. Stories survive of couples who courted secretly or challenged their families' wishes. The line between obedience and desire was often blurred. One quirky detail from England. At some medieval fairs there were courtship staves, decorated poles that young men would carry to signal their availability and interest in a particular woman. These staves could be quite elaborate, sometimes carved with symbols or painted in bright colors, acting like a medieval version of a dating profile. Carrying one required courage, because it made your intentions public. On the other hand, failing to follow social rules could have serious consequences. Premarital relationships that became too physical risked harsh punishments, from fines to public humiliation. The church and local authorities enforced moral codes, often with a heavy hand, underscoring the seriousness of romantic conduct. And then there's the matter of communication. Letters were rare, expensive, and often risky, so most courting relied on face-to-face interactions, or the careful delivery of tokens and messages by trusted intermediaries, family members, friends, or servants. The secrecy and symbolism made courtship an intricate dance of signs and signals. In sum, medieval courtship was a far cry from modern dating apps or casual conversations. It was a careful, communal performance rooted in social order, faith, and survival. But beneath the rules, the nervous glances and the whispered promises, real affection took root, often surprisingly resilient and heartfelt. The stone corridors of the monastery echo with quiet footsteps, candlelight flickering against cold walls. In theory, nothing stirs here beyond whispered prayers and rustling robes. But if you lean in a little, behind the Latin chants and the scent of beeswax, you might just catch the faintest trace of longing. Because even in these sanctuaries of devotion, hearts sometimes wandered. For monks and nuns in medieval Europe, romance was off limits. Full stop. Their vows of chastity weren't suggestions. They were eternal commitments, sacred promises to God. But humans are complicated creatures, and not even thick walls and rigid schedules could completely silence the tug of affection. Let's set the scene. A young novice, barely into adulthood, has spent months, maybe years, living by strict monastic rules. Rise at dawn, chant psalms, copy manuscripts, eat bread, sweep floors, pray, rinse, repeat. Then a visiting brother from a neighboring abbey arrives, or a nun glimpsed across the cloister during a rare shared service. One meaningful look, one brush of hands during the passing of a relic, and boom, trouble. Mainstream accounts paint monastic life as entirely sexless, and it mostly was, at least in theory, but plenty of records hint otherwise. Letters, court records, and the occasional scandalous chronicle speak of emotional entanglements, and yes, secret affairs. Some were purely spiritual bonds, intense, idealized friendships that mirrored romance. Others, well, were more carnal than contemplative. One particularly infamous case comes from 12th century France, where a monk and nun carried on a passionate affair through letters. Historians still debate whether those letters, now legendary, were truly theirs or a later literary invention. Either way, their fiery prose and tragic fallout fueled centuries of speculation, heartbreak, and weirdly enough, book sales. And don't think these forbidden crushes were always male-female. Historians still argue whether some same-gender pairings inside monastic life were romantic, platonic, or something in between. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled by any of it. But affection doesn't always obey theology. A soft gaze over a shared hymn book could light a spark, even if both parties had sworn off fire. Now here's your fringe tidbit. Some monasteries and nunneries had escape tunnels. Seriously. While many were probably built for security, bandits, political turmoil, the occasional angry peasant mob, it's not exactly hard to imagine a lovesick friar or daring nun slipping away by lantern light. There are scattered tales of cloister breakers caught mid-escape, often punished with transfers, penance, or in extreme cases, excommunication. But a few vanished into the fog and were never heard from again. The medieval version of ghosting, but with more horses and slightly worse hygiene. Of course, not all feelings turned into scandal. Some remained buried, translated into extra prayers, redirected into art or music. Monasteries weren't just dormitories for the overly devout. They were also cultural hubs. Scribes didn't just copy texts, they illuminated them, decorating letters with little gold leaf vines and occasionally cheeky images that monks really shouldn't have been doodling. Some scholars think those drawings, full of strange animals and mischievous scenes, were quiet acts of rebellion, or lonely hearts letting off steam. And speaking of lonely, solitude itself was a major ingredient in this emotional stew. Living a life of silence, your thoughts looping endlessly, your only conversations scripted by the liturgy, it's enough to make any stray feeling loom large. A simple kindness could echo louder than it should. A shared smile could feel like a spark. That's the thing about isolation. It can amplify what little connection slips through. Even the confessional wasn't entirely safe from all this. Stories exist of confessors and penitents falling for each other, sometimes resulting in dramatic fallout. One monk reportedly received weekly confessions from a local noblewoman and eventually confessed to her. The irony writes itself. And yet, the church tried desperately to stamp all this out. Rules were added, supervision increased, physical boundaries were reinforced, but still, it kept happening. Because human hearts, as it turns out, aren't easily legislated. Even in the quietest chapel, under the sternest rule, someone somewhere was probably daydreaming during matins. In some rare cases, these stories had oddly sweet endings. A monk who left his order to marry a nun wasn't always stoned or banished. Occasionally, especially in later centuries, these couples were forgiven, even celebrated, as if their love proved something about the power of the heart. A handful were even welcomed into secular life, and allowed to marry officially, though usually after a generous donation to the church's coffers. Can't break the rules without paying the toll. It's worth remembering, monasteries weren't prisons. People joined for many reasons, some out of faith, others because they had no choice. Unwanted younger sons, daughters too poor for dowries, those with disabilities or just unlucky timing. For some, it was a refuge. For others, a cage. And if love crept in through the cracks, was that so shocking? And so, amid the chanting and the candle smoke, little romances bloomed, quietly, cautiously, sometimes doomed, sometimes miraculous, but always very, very human. The bedchamber is hushed, save for nervous breathing and the faint creak of wooden beams overhead. It's the wedding night, and outside, half the village is pretending not to wait for proof. That's right. Tonight isn't just for the bride and groom. It's for everyone who expects to see a blood-stained sheet by sunrise. Romance, medieval style. Nothing says congrats like public proof of virginity. This wasn't just a weird tradition. It was legal, social, and religious, all bundled into one extremely uncomfortable expectation. In many regions across medieval Europe, particularly among nobility, the consummation of a marriage was the final binding act. Without it, the vows were just fancy words. And how did you prove consummation? Well, let's just say the laundry became evidence. Mainstream history makes it clear. Virginity, especially for women, was obsessively guarded. It wasn't just about personal virtue, it was political capital. A noble family's reputation could hinge on whether a bride was pure on her wedding night. This is why young women were watched like hawks, sometimes even locked up or assigned virtue guardians. And if there was any doubt, enter the infamous virginity test. Let's pause for a second. Yes, this was a thing. There were actual examinations, conducted by midwives or other local experts, to determine if a woman's body showed signs of virginity. Spoiler alert, this was junk science even by medieval standards. Hymens don't work like people thought, and purity can't be proven by poking around with candlelight and a grim expression. Still, that didn't stop communities from treating these exams as gospel. Now for a fringe detail. In some regions, the wedding night was witnessed. Sometimes literally, a noble couple might be escorted to bed by friends or servants who stayed just long enough to confirm things were headed in the right direction. Others had their sheets inspected the next morning, and in very high-stakes unions, like royal marriages, the pressure to produce proof was immense. Imagine having to consummate your marriage, knowing a bishop might be waiting for the laundry. Romantic, right? Historians still argue whether these rituals were consistently enforced or more symbolic, depending on region and class. Some scholars believe many of these traditions were exaggerated later as a way to mock the past. Others insist there's too much evidence to doubt their regularity, especially in areas where property, inheritance, and alliances were on the line. But wait, it gets more awkward. Sometimes the couple didn't even like each other. Marriages were arranged for land, titles, and political advantage, not passion. And yet consummation was still required. If it didn't happen, either partner could challenge the validity of the union. So yes, people were legally compelled to have sex. Consent was assumed after the ceremony. The whole thing blurs the line between duty and deeply personal decisions in ways modern minds find hard to stomach. And if it really wasn't working? There were incredibly impotence trials. These were real legal cases, where one spouse accused the other of not being able to perform their conjugal duties. Evidence could include testimony from previous lovers, awkward medical examinations, even more awkward, and in one case, a public demonstration involving a court-appointed witness. If this feels like a Monty Python sketch, you're not alone. But to them, this was serious law. Among peasants, things were less formal, but not necessarily less stressful. The church still demanded proof of a valid marriage, meaning consummation, and neighbors were often more than willing to gossip. A girl seen returning home at dawn after a wedding feast might find herself grilled by her mother and 10 of her aunties, and if things went wrong, a quick trip to the confessional booth might follow, along with a generous donation or a slightly panicked redo of the vows. Here's where we get one of the rare bits of levity. In some towns, villagers would hold mock ceremonies or charivaris for newlyweds. These were noisy parades involving pots, pans, bawdy songs, and occasionally a fake bridal procession with a man in a dress. It was embarrassing, rowdy, and meant to make fun of any union seen as suspicious, too old, too young, too quick, or just weird. So imagine consummating your marriage with the echo of frying pans being banged outside your window. Nothing sets the mood like your neighbors doing interpretive dance to a drunken hurdy-gurdy tune. Not every culture in medieval Europe leaned quite so heavily on blood-soaked proof. In some places, symbolic acts were enough. The couple might lie in the same bed with witnesses present and fully clothed, or exchange vows before a priest and call it done. Still, the anxiety around proving purity and consummation haunted generations of brides and not a few grooms too. And let's not forget the church's role. Marriage was a sacrament, and consummation was part of the sacred bond. But priests weren't always helpful. Some offered guidance, others just issued threats. If you don't complete this union, it's a sin. If you enjoy it too much, it's a sin. If you do it on Sunday, definitely a sin. Medieval religious advice, extremely clear and wildly confusing at the same time. There's also the tale of one bride who was so nervous she fainted before reaching the chamber. Her husband, confused and terrified of doing something wrong, reportedly spent the night sitting awkwardly on the edge of the bed. The next day, their families called in a priest. Try again, he advised. They did. It worked. Romance? Maybe not. But at least no one got excommunicated. So while we might laugh at the strangeness of it all now, the truth is that medieval newlyweds carried a heavy weight on their shoulders, and not just emotional. Their union affected families, lands, alliances, and reputations. That first night wasn't private. Not really. It was a performance, a contract, and a test, all rolled into one, with very, very high stakes. The flickering candle sputters in a carved wall niche, casting shifting shadows across a stone chamber lined with embroidered tapestries and velvet cushions. Outside, a lute's melancholy notes drift in from the hall, played by some moody troubadour who's almost certainly in love with someone wildly inappropriate. Welcome to courtly love, equal parts performance, poetry, and excruciating etiquette. In the world of castles and courtyards, love wasn't wild or impulsive. It was a carefully rehearsed drama. Courtship among the nobility followed elaborate rituals that made modern dating look like fast food. You didn't just fall in love, you climbed it, like a tower, with proper manners, practiced lines, and the occasional chess match. Let's talk roles. The man, usually a knight or a young noble, was the adoring pursuer. The woman, almost always of higher status or at least married, was the aloof object of affection. That's right, The whole thing often revolved around loving someone you couldn't and wouldn't marry. Very practical, very painful. Mainstream accounts from the 12th century onward describe this structure in vivid detail. The knight pledges service to his lady, who might reward him with a glance, a token, or if he was very lucky, a few kind words. These tokens were serious business: a ribbon from her gown, a handkerchief, or a charm sewn into his surcoat. He, in return, might write poetry, dedicate songs, or fight in tournaments wearing her colors. If that sounds like a Renaissance fair fantasy, it kind of was, but with real swords. Historians still argue whether courtly love ever translated into actual physical relationships. Some claim it was all metaphor, an emotional, even spiritual, exercise. Others think a fair number of knights were sneaking into gardens after dark. The truth? Probably both. Some played the part, others played with fire. And it wasn't just men writing lovesick poetry. Women, too, expressed passion and longing through song. In southern France, the troubadours, female troubadours, composed verses from the woman's perspective, often clever, sharp, and undeniably bold. Fringe detail. One troubadour wrote a poem about being bored by her husband and dreaming of a more vigorous companion. Subtlety was optional. Courtly love was especially popular in regions like Aquitaine and Provence, where Eleanor of Aquitaine helped turn flirtation into an art form. Under her influence, courts became stages where men and women enacted the theatre of desire, complete with rules, judges, and even love courts, where people argued the finer points of heartbreak and rejection. Did a lady have the right to deny her knight if he had served her faithfully for a year? Could a married woman fall in love without dishonor? These were actual debates, with transcripts, love, legally reviewed, and games. So many games. Chess was the ultimate flirtation tool. Sit across from your desired noble, silently plotting moves while sneaking glances between pawns. In literature, chess scenes are practically code for "we're totally flirting." It was slow, quiet, and full of tension, like dating, but with rules and weird horse-shaped pieces. Then there were the household staff, especially the ever-present ladies-in-waiting and clever squires, who were often dragged into these affairs as secret messengers. Think of them as medieval text message chains, except they had to sneak through kitchens and keep a straight face during dinner. They delivered letters, arranged meetings, and occasionally provided cover stories. No, my lady isn't in the garden with Sir Geoffrey. She's at confession. Yes, again. But not everyone was enamored with all this courtly performance. Some clergymen denounced it as sinful nonsense, distracting people from real virtue. You can't love God if you're too busy writing limericks about Lady Rosalind's elbows, one bishop reportedly muttered, and yet the trend persisted, partly because it created a space for expressing emotions in a society that often stifled them. And make no mistake, courtly love was full of emotion. It was designed to be painful, to keep the object of desire forever just out of reach. It wasn't about happy endings, it was about longing, suffering, even. The more unattainable the beloved, the more poetic the anguish. It was emotional masochism, with feathered hats. Still, sometimes, it worked. Against the odds, some courtly flirtations blossomed into real partnerships. One noblewoman reportedly fell so deeply for the knight who wrote her monthly poems that she defied her family and married him. Legend says their wedding included a reading of the sonnet that first captured her heart, and a warning glare from her uncle, who thought the whole thing was foolish. True love, one part poetry, one part rebellion. Yet for every happy ending, there were a dozen stories of pining without payoff. A knight who waited 20 years for a lady's affection, only to be thanked politely and sent on his way. A noble woman who wore her suitor's ribbon, even as she married someone else for land. Heartbreak was practically a genre, and let's not forget the love potions. These popped up in both literature and reality. Spiced wines laced with herbs, charms tucked under pillows, or wax figures meant to bind a heart with magic. Historians still debate how common these were, but references appear often enough to suggest people really tried them. Whether they worked is anyone's guess. But given the level of desperation, it's not surprising that someone thought, well, maybe this nettle and honey brew will make him notice me. In the end, Courtly love gave people permission to feel, to pine, to write, to suffer beautifully. Whether it led to secret kisses or just wistful sighs during a banquet, it carved out emotional space in a rigid world. Beneath the silks and sonnets, these nobles were just humans. Awkward, yearning, occasionally ridiculous humans hoping a verse or a glance might lead to something more. The ink is still wet on the parchment. A priest looks it over one more time, nods solemnly, and places it in a carved wooden chest. No hearts drawn in the margins here. This isn't a love letter, it's a contract. A legal document that states exactly who is marrying whom, what lands and animals are changing hands, and how many eggs per year the bride's family has promised in dowry. Welcome to the legal side of love in medieval Europe. It's not poetic, it's paperwork. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a sacred bond, yes, but it was also a binding legal agreement with real consequences. Church and state worked together to control who could marry, when, why, and what happened if things went sideways. Forget diamond rings. If you wanted to show you were serious, you needed witnesses, a dowry inventory, and probably a notary who smelled faintly of ink and boiled onions. Here's the mainstream truth. By the 12th century, the church had successfully claimed jurisdiction over marriage. This meant that while families might arrange matches, and lords might approve them, the church decided if it was valid. And that power? Oh, they used clerics recorded vows, judged annulments, investigated illegitimacy, and made sure everyone remembered marriage was holy, permanent, and not to be entered lightly. Unless, of course, you paid the right fee. One core requirement was consent. Both parties had to agree freely to the union, at least in theory. In practice, consent could be whispered, coerced, assumed, or recorded after the fact. A bride nodding at her father's urging counted. A couple declaring they were married now and forever in a barn, also valid, if witnessed. There are even cases where someone yelling "I take you as mine" during a fair followed by a nod and a shared drink ended up in court as a real marriage. That's where canon law came in. Canon lawyers were experts in the rules governing marriage, from who could wed to whether second cousins counted as too close. Spoiler, they often did. They debated things like spiritual incest. Basically, if your godparent was too connected to you to allow a match, and consanguinity, which was just a fancy way of saying your family tree's too tangled. Historians still argue whether all this legal oversight was meant to protect the vulnerable or control society. On one hand, the church's insistence on mutual consent gave some women an escape from forced marriages. On the other, their grip on the rules meant that love outside approved lines, like between classes or faiths, was quickly squashed. Love wasn't blind, it was red-taped. Now, let's say things went wrong. Maybe the groom vanished. Maybe the bride turned out to be already married to someone else. Or maybe both parties decided, one awkward breakfast in, that they'd made a terrible mistake. Enter the annulment. Unlike divorce, which was forbidden by the church, annulment meant the marriage had never been valid to begin with. Common grounds included one party being underage, already married, too closely related, mentally unfit, or forced into the match. And yes, lack of consummation counted, as we saw earlier. But proving that, oh the mess. Cue character witnesses, bedroom testimonies, and sometimes even medical examinations. Imagine trying to prove you hadn't done something in a time when privacy was almost non-existent. One famous fringe case involved a woman who sought annulment after discovering her husband had a tail. Yes, a literal tail. Historians debate whether this was a metaphor, a birth defect, or just 13th century shade, but the court heard her out. The verdict? Unclear. But it's safe to say marriage courts were never boring. Another fascinating wrinkle: clandestine marriages. These were unions made in secret. No priest, no ceremony, just a couple speaking vows to each other and maybe sharing a symbolic item, like a ring or a loaf of bread. Technically valid under canon law, terribly inconvenient for families trying to plan alliances. There are records of parents dragging couples before bishops, yelling. They claimed they were married behind the stables, and bishops annoyed but resigned, often agreeing, well yes, that counts. To prevent chaos, the church introduced rules. Marriages had to be announced in advance, called banns, celebrated in public, and overseen by a priest. But enforcement was spotty. Rural communities often did things their own way, and if a couple disappeared for a few hours and came back acting weird, well, people talked. And let's not forget the dowry. Dowries weren't optional for most noble and merchant families. A bride's family was expected to provide land, animals, money, or valuable goods, meant to help set up the new household. But they were also strategic. A large dowry could make a less attractive match appealing. A small one might doom a brilliant romance, and if the husband died, the dowry was supposed to return to the woman or her family. Some enterprising women used marriage law to their advantage. One clever widow in Italy took her third husband to court for mismanaging her dowry. She won too. In some areas, especially urban ones, women knew the legal ropes and weren't afraid to tug on them. It wasn't universal empowerment, but it was something. All of this, contracts, consent, annulments, dowries, made marriage a legal minefield. And behind every union was a small army of priests, scribes, relatives, and nosy neighbors watching closely. Romantic? Not exactly. But it was the system, and within its tangled rules, real love sometimes still managed to bloom. So next time someone tells you love is simple, just picture two medieval lawyers arguing over whether a shared chicken counted as proof of matrimony. Because in the Middle Ages, even affection had to be notarized. The air smells faintly of hay, smoke, and turnips. A dog barks somewhere near the riverbank. A boy chases a runaway chicken past a row of mud brick cottages. This is peasant life. Gritty, sun-cracked, and absolutely not the backdrop for silk-robed serenades. But don't let the rough edges fool you. Romance still happened here. It just wore clogs instead of cloaks. While noble love came wrapped in layers of etiquette and embroidered kerchiefs, the romance of common folk was shaped by dirt, distance, and daily chores. A peasant's life was hard, sunrise to sunset work, no free time, and zero privacy. And yet, even under the weight of toil, people found each other, often over shared labor, a mug of ale, or a particularly spirited sheep shearing. Mainstream historians agree that peasants had more say in who they married than their noble counterparts. Without vast estates or royal blood to complicate matters, village love stories were often guided by practical compatibility. Could you haul firewood, milk a goat, keep up in the fields without complaining? Congratulations, you just became 10 times more attractive. Marriage was still a community event though. It needed the approval of family, neighbors, and of course the local priest. But in terms of emotional connection, peasants had a leg up. They worked side by side, grew up together, and saw each other in all seasons, literally and figuratively. There were fewer illusions and more honesty. And yes, plenty of teasing. One fringe detail worth noting. In parts of Northern Europe, festivals called courting Sundays gave unmarried young people a semi-structured chance to mingle. The idea was that eligible men and women could walk together after church, sometimes even try out living together for a while, supervised by family or neighbors. Think of it as medieval speed dating, but with more wool and fewer rules about deodorant. Of course, flirting in a thatched village wasn't always smooth. Imagine trying to impress someone while covered in pig muck, or stealing glances during Mass while the priest drones on about eternal damnation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. A girl might braid a ribbon into her hair before market day. A boy might linger a little longer at the mill, hoping to catch someone's eye. These weren't grand gestures, they were survival-level small ones. But in a world where even a single apple could be a gift, a smile meant something. Historians still argue how much agency women had in these relationships. Some records suggest daughters had a say in their marriage choices, especially in regions with strong village communities. Others imply fathers or entire extended families held veto power. The truth probably falls somewhere in between, depending on wealth, land, and personality. One bold young woman might convince her parents with tears and charm. Another might be married off before she even hit 16. And then there's the alehouse, a classic medieval social hub. By nightfall, These smoky, loud spaces buzzed with gossip, laughter, and the occasional scuffle. It's where young people could mix under the pretext of communal drinking, which often turned into subtle hand-holding or drunken declarations of love. Or, less poetically, loud belching contests followed by declarations of "you're not like the other girls, Maud." Sometimes, these connections led to handfasting. Handfasting was a betrothal ceremony, a kind of engagement that could, depending on region and era, count as an informal marriage. It usually involved clasped hands, spoken vows, and maybe a shared cup or blanket. Once handfasted, couples were often considered semi-married, especially if they'd started living together. No need to wait for a grand church ceremony. Just a fire, some bread, and maybe your cousin, standing in as witness, because he happened to be passing by with a goose. And if a pregnancy followed, the priest got involved, and fast. Babies born outside of marriage were heavily frowned upon. But if the parents were handfasted or soon to be wed, the child was usually accepted. If not, things could get difficult. The church might demand penance, the community might gossip. In worse cases, the mother could face punishment. But in many villages, people were surprisingly pragmatic. They understood that life was messy, that affection didn't always wait for a signature, and that a healthy baby was still a blessing, even if it came early. Now for a favorite quirky tidbit, some villages had love ladders. Yes, actual ladders. If a boy wanted to court a girl, he might lean a ladder against her cottage after dark and whisper through the shutters. If she welcomed him, he'd climb up for a chaste chat, or not so chaste, depending on who you ask. If she didn't, the ladder stayed unused, and he took it back with bruised pride. It was a gesture equal parts romantic and ridiculous, and honestly kind of charming. But peasant life didn't always allow for long courtships. Practical needs help with farming, merging small plots of land, managing livestock, often sped things along. Do you like each other was secondary to can we make this work? That's not to say love was missing, it just wore simpler clothes. And let's not ignore the seasons. Spring festivals and harvest dances were crucial social mixers. After months of cold and silence, people burst into open-air feasts with food, drink, and group dances designed to get everyone laughing, and occasionally paired up. The maypole wasn't just a pretty decoration, it was a signal. Hey, it's warm again. Let's flirt awkwardly in public. Even weddings themselves were community events more than private ceremonies. The whole village might be involved, helping prepare food, singing bawdy songs, and celebrating late into the night. It wasn't about lace or centerpieces. It was about barley stew, borrowed tunics, and everyone crammed into a barn to dance. Peasant romance may not have been idealized in song or tapestry, but it was grounded, necessary, and at times surprisingly tender. A shared chore, a whispered joke during shearing, a pair of boots mended without being asked. Love that came not from fairy tales, but from familiarity and quiet resilience. Because when you live in a one-room house with 8 siblings, a goat, and a drafty roof, finding someone who makes you laugh and doesn't mind the smell of turnips, that's as good as any knight's poem. Smoke curls lazily from the chimney of a manor house. Inside, behind thick oak doors, a noblewoman stares out the window while a servant brushes her hair. She's married, of course, has been for years. Her husband is off hunting or brokering something tedious, and yet her heart skips when she hears a certain set of boots in the corridor. They don't belong to her husband, they belong to trouble. Affairs in medieval Europe were like badly written love poems, dramatic, risky, and usually doomed. Yet despite the danger, both social and literal, people still broke the rules. Desire, like water, finds cracks in even the sturdiest walls, especially when those walls are built around a loveless marriage, a lonely castle, or a particularly smoldering knight who doesn't know how to knock. Mainstream history usually focuses on the proper side of medieval relationships: arranged marriages, church-sanctioned unions, and family-approved liaisons. But just beneath the surface lies a shadowy world of forbidden love, secret rendezvous, and scandalous outcomes. The records are full of people caught in compromising situations, from the highborn to the humble, all navigating a society that preached virtue but often practiced something murkier. One famous example: Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, already a hotspot of poetic longing and political intrigue, became legendary for its rumoured liaisons. Some stories suggest she and King Henry II maintained a deeply strained relationship, especially after his dalliances with fair Rosamund Clifford. Whether Eleanor had affairs of her own is still debated. Historians argue over letters, gestures, and gaps in records, like conspiracy theorists, with corkboards. Maybe she did, maybe she just wanted to. Among nobles, love affairs could be politically explosive. A lady's infidelity wasn't just about broken hearts, it threatened bloodlines. If a noblewoman bore a child not fathered by her husband, it could throw inheritance into chaos, which is why so many scandals were buried fast and deep, whispered about. Yes, but rarely proven. If someone noticed a child looked suspiciously like the visiting harpist, they politely looked away. But here's your fringe tidbit. In some parts of Europe, noble households hired bedchamber spies. These were trusted servants whose job was to monitor, subtly of course, the lady of the house. They reported strange visitors, unexplained absences, or that awkward moment when the gardener suddenly started wearing better shoes. Think medieval private eye, but with fewer trench coats and more embroidery. Meanwhile, among the lower classes, scandal carried fewer political consequences, but just as much personal risk. A married peasant caught with someone else might face public shaming, fines, or even a church-mandated penance. And let's not forget the infamous cucking stool, a punishment for women accused of infidelity. Yes, they really strapped people into chairs and dunked them in rivers. Clean conscience by way of cold water. Still, the heart wants what it wants, and secret lovers found ways to meet. A miller's wife might slip out at night under cover of flower runs. A blacksmith might arrange extra horseshoes just to spend time near someone else's barn. Letters were passed under bread loaves, through stained gloves, or folded into ribbons, and sometimes they didn't even bother with secrecy. They just braced themselves for the fallout. Some of these affairs ended in tragedy. There are tales of lovers banished, imprisoned, even executed. One young squire in Burgundy was reportedly hanged for seducing a married noblewoman. His defense: "She told me to." It didn't work. Others became legend. The story of Tristan and Isolde, one of the most famous medieval romances, centers on adulterous love, a love potion, and inevitable doom. It was copied, translated, and sung across Europe. People were obsessed with the tale, even as they clutched their rosaries and condemned adultery, because forbidden love, it's always made for juicy storytelling. But not all forbidden love was so dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, a series of glances during Mass, a brush of hands during a shared chore, a moment too long at the well. These emotional affairs, unconsummated but still intense, were just as risky. One record describes a man exiled from his village, not for touching a married woman, but for desiring her with unruly spirit. No one's entirely sure what that means, but we can assume his vibes were considered illegal. Historians still debate whether affairs were more common than we think, just better hidden, or genuinely rare, because of the risks. Some argue that peasant communities were tightly knit, making secrecy almost impossible. Others point to court records full of gossip and accusation, suggesting everyone was at least trying to get away with something. Interestingly, the church often played both sides. Publicly, it condemned all forms of adultery, but privately, some priests turned a blind eye, especially if the lovers were wealthy patrons. A noble might confess a dozen dalliances and receive nothing more than a stern prayer and a suggestion to donate a new bell. Justice, like so many things, was negotiable. And then there were the professional go-betweens, women and a few men who specialized in arranging secret meetings. These unofficial matchmakers operated in the shadows, helping coordinate trysts in barns, gardens, or even confessionals. If caught, they faced harsh penalties, but while they lasted, they were the backbone of the medieval romance underworld. Of course, not every affair ended in ruin. Some lovers ran away together, eloping into the forest, vanishing to another town, or joining a traveling troupe of musicians. It didn't always work out, but every now and then, it did. They started a new life, became someone else, and left scandal behind like an old pair of boots. So the next time you think medieval people were too busy digging ditches and praying to fall into temptation, remember, behind every respectable marriage portrait, there was probably a servant holding a letter that smelled faintly of lavender and trouble. Because in the end, love has never obeyed rules. Not even when those rules were written in Latin and backed by sword, scripture, or stool. The door creaks open on a modest timber-framed cottage. A woman in her 40s stoops slightly as she enters, her hands rough from years of spinning and soap-making. Her husband died last winter, chest cold turned worse, and now everyone's wondering what she'll do. Mourn in black forever, remarry for help with the fields, sell the goats and move in with her son. Ah, widowhood in medieval Europe, part grief, part strategy, and very possibly, part second chance. Unlike today, life expectancy in the Middle Ages was famously short, somewhere around 30-40 years on average. But that number's misleading. Many people lived into their 60s or 70s if they survived childhood and childbirth. Still, early death was common enough that most people expected to marry more than once. In fact, it was almost routine. You lose a spouse, you bury them quickly, you mourn publicly, and then the matchmaking begins. Among peasants, the decision to remarry was often practical. Who would help plough the fields, watch the children, muck the stables? Grief didn't stop the chores. A widow with property, especially one who inherited land or tools, suddenly became one of the most eligible women in the village. That's right. The same person who was ignored at last year's harvest dance might now be fielding discreet inquiries from 3 different shepherds and a very ambitious corper. Mainstream history shows that widows, particularly among the working classes, enjoyed a rare burst of autonomy. With their husband gone, they could own land, enter contracts, and make decisions without male permission. Something unmarried women and wives couldn't always do. This sliver of freedom didn't go unnoticed, either. Some widows chose not to remarry, preferring to keep control of their household and avoid another round of obedience vows. That said, not all widows were left well off. Many faced deep financial losses, especially if the dowry or land returned to the husband's family. Church and community sometimes stepped in to help, but more often than not, survival meant remarriage or living with relatives, which wasn't always a dream come true. Imagine sharing a kitchen with your sister-in-law who's convinced your pickled cabbage is inferior. Here's your fringe tidbit. In some towns, widows were courted with songs. Local bachelors would gather outside their homes at night and sing poorly in hopes of winning favor. This wasn't exactly a medieval version of The Bachelor, but it came close. A woman might listen from behind shutters, blushing or rolling her eyes, or, if unimpressed, pour chamberpot contents on the performers, romantic in its own soggy way. Among nobles, widowhood came with higher stakes. A young widow with a title or land could become the object of intense political scheming. Who she married next could shift alliances, change loyalties, or trigger wars. That's why kings and queens often rushed to arrange marriages for highborn widows, even if the ink on the funeral scroll wasn't dry. Sometimes these women resisted. Eleanor of Aquitaine, after being widowed by the King of France, turned around and married the future King of England without asking anyone's permission. Historians still argue whether that was love, strategy, or just Eleanor being the medieval queen of doing whatever she pleased. Other noble widows embraced their new independence. Some managed estates with sharp skill, overseeing crops, resolving disputes, and collecting rents like seasoned landlords. A few even led troops or built churches. In Italy, one widow turned her husband's former guardhouse into a home for orphans. Another in Bohemia was known for writing passionate letters to her second husband, whom she chose herself, scandalously without papal input. But remarrying wasn't always easy. The church allowed it, but grudgingly. Marriage was sacred, after all, and widowhood was considered a holy opportunity for chastity and reflection. Many widows were encouraged, especially by priests, to devote themselves to prayer, charity, and a quieter life. Some did, others pretended to. Still others ignored that advice completely and found themselves dancing at another wedding feast before the year was out. The church required a waiting period, often called a mourning year, before remarriage. This wasn't just about respect, it was about making sure the widow wasn't pregnant, thereby avoiding paternity disputes. But the rule wasn't always enforced. A well-connected widow could remarry in months if she had the right bishop, the right gold, or the right smile. One fascinating legal wrinkle. In many towns, widows had rights to dower, a portion of their husband's estate set aside for their use after his death. It usually included a third of his property and was intended to keep her from starving. But greedy in-laws or dodgy clerks sometimes challenged this. Legal battles erupted, complete with shouted testimony, forged wills, and a lot of finger-pointing over old goats and barley sacks. Among the middle class, especially in merchant towns, widows often took over their husband's trade. A woman might inherit a weaving business, a bakery, or even a money-lending operation. And she didn't just keep it running, she expanded it. Records show some widows growing wealthier after their husband's death, hiring apprentices and forming guild alliances. Power, it turns out, didn't always come with a sword. Sometimes it came with a ledger and a mean sourdough starter. Not all second marriages were joyless arrangements. Some were genuine love matches, especially if both partners were older and more realistic. They'd been through illness, death, financial woes, and children who didn't sleep. They weren't chasing poetry, they were looking for kindness, warmth, and maybe someone who could mend a sock or laugh at the same dumb jokes. And among the elderly, remarriage could be surprisingly sweet. There's a record of a couple in England, both in their 60s, who married late in life after decades of being neighbors. They'd both lost spouses, raised families, and finally decided to face their twilight years together. Their only request at the church: no singing. You get the sense they'd heard enough of that already. So while widowhood carried real hardship, it also cracked open space for decision, resilience, and in some lucky cases, new beginnings. Whether out of love, necessity, or pure stubbornness, medieval widows helped reshape what it meant to choose again, even when the world expected them to quietly fade into black veils and soft prayers. A wooden bench creaks under the weight of two nervous teenagers. They're alone, but not really. Behind a half-open door, someone's pretending to sweep, ears perked. Outside, an older cousin lurks just in case. The couple sits close enough to feel each other's breath, hands nearly touching, trying to decide whether what they're doing counts as marriage. Because in medieval Europe, sometimes it actually did. This is handfasting, an unofficial, sometimes temporary union that walked the hazy line between engagement, trial marriage, and we're just figuring it out. For many couples, especially among the lower classes, it was how love and practicality negotiated terms before the priest got involved. Mainstream history recognizes handfasting as a kind of pre-marriage contract. It wasn't always formal, sometimes it was just a public vow, two people clasping hands and declaring their intent to be together. Sometimes there were witnesses, a symbolic token or a shared drink. Occasionally, it was tied to specific dates, like a year and a day. If, by the end of that period, both parties were happy, a church wedding might follow. If not, well, they could part ways. No lawyers, no annulments, just a slightly awkward run-in at market a week later. Historians still argue whether handfasting was considered a valid marriage in itself. Canon law required free consent and consummation, but it wasn't picky about location or formal ceremony. So if two people privately declared themselves wed, then shared a bed, some courts accepted that as binding. Other regions insisted only a priest could make it official. The confusion was real, especially when inheritance and legitimacy came into play. Imagine being the kid whose parents might have been married, depending on whether Uncle Gerald remembered that one night by the haystack correctly. And there were plenty of haystack situations. Let's be honest, young couples didn't always wait for the wedding. In rural villages, where priests might only visit occasionally and banns took weeks, many simply jumped the line. A promise, a newt together, and voila, married, or at least something that looked close enough. Fringe tidbit time. In some regions of Scotland and northern England, handfasting could be so widely recognized that couples didn't bother with the church at all. These unions were often celebrated with local customs, tying cloth around the couple's wrists, jumping over a broom, or sharing symbolic food. While the church grumbled, it often turned a blind eye unless someone made a fuss or got pregnant before the banns. And oh, pregnancy. Medieval Europe's great relationship accelerant. If a baby was on the way, everything sped up. Priests were summoned, dowries negotiated. Parents sighed. In many communities, couples who had premarital relations were simply expected to marry. If they didn't, the church might impose public penance, often involving standing barefoot at the church door in your plainest clothes, confessing your deeds while your neighbors judged your repentance and your fashion sense. Yet not all communities treated premarital pregnancy the same. Some were scandalized, others shrugged and moved on, especially if the couple made things right quickly. Among peasants, where life was short and practical, love and biology often outpaced theology. And this brings us to the baby bump paradox. A visibly pregnant bride raised eyebrows. Sure, but also proved fertility, which was valuable. In noble circles, this could be both blessing and curse. On one hand, you're marrying someone who can produce heirs. On the other, you've got a scandal to manage, especially if the father's identity is in question. One particularly messy case from 14th century France involved a noblewoman who gave birth just weeks after her wedding. The local bishop held a formal inquiry, questioning servants and counting backward on his fingers. The conclusion: God works in mysterious ways. Translation: we'll allow it, but don't do it again. Among the middle-class merchants, artisans, skilled trades, handfasting and trial marriages were a way to test compatibility. You wanted someone who could handle both business and babies. Living together before a formal wedding wasn't officially sanctioned, but it happened. Couples learned each other's habits, saw how the other handled stress, and got a preview of what life would look like with shared debt and noisy neighbors. And just like today, some pairings fizzled. Maybe he was too lazy. Maybe she hated the way he chewed. Maybe neither could agree on what to name the pigs. If things didn't work out, the couple might split, and while it wasn't ideal, it wasn't always scandalous either. Villagers knew how these things went. It was embarrassing, but survivable. There's even a legend of a couple in rural England who handfasted every year, just in case. On their anniversary, they'd clasp hands again and re-swear their promises. A little romantic, a little practical, and highly suspicious if your neighbors thought you were dodging the church tithe again. The church, unsurprisingly, disapproved. Over time, it worked to clamp down on handfasting, insisting that all marriages be public, priest-blessed, and properly recorded. By the late Middle Ages, secret vows were treated with more skepticism, especially in regions where property disputes ran hot. Still, many couples clung to the tradition, either out of habit or quiet defiance. And handfasting had one more curious feature: flexibility. In rare cases, it was used for temporary unions, especially in remote or frontier communities. Think of it like a medieval pilot episode. Let's see if this works, and if not, no hard feelings. It wasn't common, but the concept persisted in folk tales and legal side notes, making scholars tilt their heads and mutter, "Wait, what now?" In the end, handfasting captured the messy middle ground between ideal and real. It gave couples a chance to choose imperfectly, sometimes impulsively, occasionally brilliantly. Before the altar, before the feasting, before the paperwork, there was just this: two people, hands clasped, hearts uncertain, hoping it would be enough. Because in a world ruled by rules, a private promise was still sacred, even if the bed was straw and the witnesses were just a couple of chickens. Wheels creak as a cart trundles down a muddy road, its axles complaining every inch of the way. A cloaked figure perched on a sack of barley hums to himself, a tune half remembered from a tavern 2 towns back. He's a merchant, or maybe a wandering scribe, or perhaps a minor knight, with too little gold and too much charm. Whatever his trade, one thing's certain: he's left more than a few sighing hearts behind him. Because in medieval Europe, love didn't stay put, it traveled. Traveling romances were often born of circumstance and serendipity. Unlike today's endless connectivity, the medieval world operated at the pace of hooves and wind that made every meeting precious and every goodbye a potential heartbreak. Pilgrims, knights, minstrels, and traders crisscrossed the continent, sleeping in inns, monasteries, and sometimes barns. Along the way, they flirted, wrote verses, made promises, and very occasionally, kept them. Mainstream history tells us that most people in the Middle Ages lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. True, but the ones who did travel left outsized footprints in the world of romance. They were exotic, mysterious, full of stories. A merchant who'd seen Moorish Spain, a squire returning from a siege, a nun who had fled her convent. It happened more than you'd think. Their experiences shimmered with novelty, and to those stuck in one place, novelty was almost irresistible. Take the knight-errant, a familiar figure in medieval literature, and to some extent in real life. These young men rode out seeking adventure, honor, and often distraction. In every castle or manor they passed, they might leave behind a poem, a charm, or a scandal. Sometimes all three. Some even carried letters of introduction, essentially medieval business cards, with extra flourishes and dubious claims of nobility. Historians still argue whether most traveling romances were truly romantic or more transactional. A lone traveler, after all, was vulnerable. They often relied on the kindness of strangers, especially hospitable women in inns or village homes. In return, some offered protection, entertainment, or gifts. Were these relationships genuine connections or pragmatic exchanges? It likely depended on the people and how charming the visitor was. Fringe detail. Some traveling entertainers, particularly minstrels, were trained in the art of romantic persuasion. Not just how to play the lute or recite poetry, but how to tailor a verse to win favor. One handbook for troubadours includes tips on reading a lady's eyes, interpreting posture, and delivering compliments that wouldn't offend her father. Honestly, it sounds like a 13th century pickup artist manual, just with more rhyming couplets. The church, naturally, disapproved. Travelers were seen as suspicious, loose, unaccountable, likely to corrupt the virtuous and confuse the stable rhythms of local life. Priests often warned young women to avoid strange men with stranger tongues, which, let's be fair, only made them more intriguing. And if a young woman ran off with one of these charming vagabonds, cue sermons, search parties, and in some cases, hastily arranged annulments. Not all traveling lovers were men, though. Some women traveled too, disguised as pilgrims, merchants, or men. A few sought lovers they'd met briefly, but couldn't forget. Others were widows, or nuns escaping restrictive lives. These journeys were dangerous, but powerful. One tale from 14th century Italy speaks of a woman who walked hundreds of miles to find the soldier who once saved her life. When she found him, he didn't recognize her. She wept. He offered her a place by his fire. They married a year later. Whether it's true or not, people retold it like a legend for generations. Of course, many romances were fleeting. A traveling man might leave behind a hand-carved token or a half-empty wineskin. A pregnant woman might be left explaining that her suitor was a merchant from Flanders who promised to return. He never did. Communities developed coping mechanisms, strong support systems, occasional shunning, and in some cases naming the child after the visitor, in a bizarre blend of hope and passive aggression. And then there were the reunions, rare, dramatic, occasionally invented. A knight returns from war to find the maiden who swore to wait for him now, runs her family's vineyard, and carries a sword herself. A minstrel comes back to the town where he once kissed a baker's daughter, only to discover she's married to a blacksmith twice his size. Did he run? Did he stay? Did he write a sad song and disappear again? Yes, probably all three. Some of these stories became ballads, traveling songs that told of love found and lost. On the road, the lyrics drifted from village to village, changing slightly each time, until no one could remember who the original lovers were. But their emotions lingered in every verse, love as a thing that passed through, like weather, unpredictable, dangerous, glorious. Interestingly, traveling lovers sometimes left behind more than memories. Inheritance cases occasionally surfaced involving children born from such unions. When the father returned years later, older, richer, or married, disputes erupted. Was he responsible? Was the child legitimate? Did he even remember the mother's name? Courts debated, families fumed, and sometimes poets watched it all unfold and took notes. Even in royal courts, traveling seduction played a role. Ambassadors and envoys were notorious for their diplomatic skills, which often included seducing local ladies. Some were punished, others were discreetly rewarded. Politics and passion were more entangled than anyone wanted to admit, and romance often doubled as soft power. If a countess liked you, your treaty might go better. And then, of course, there were the married travelers, those who left spouses behind, often for months or years, and found companionship along the way. Whether those were affairs, temporary understandings, or accidental entanglements depends on who's telling the story. But jealousy traveled too. Some letters from wives include not-so-subtle reminders. I pray God you are faithful to me, as I am to you. Translation: I know you're out there flirting with every washerwoman from here to Normandy, and I'm not amused. Still, despite the risks, traveling romances endured. Because love doesn't always wait for stable housing or parental approval. Sometimes it rides up on a tired horse, offers a lopsided smile, and disappears again before the bread is cool. In a world held together by routine, these fleeting passions offered something else: surprise, intensity, and a reminder that even on the road, hearts could meet, if only for a moment. The bells toll softly across the valley, calling the faithful to morning mass. Inside the chapel, incense curls toward a vaulted ceiling, and voices rise in Latin chant. Behind the solemn faces and bowed heads, however, a quiet tension hums. Because while love might be blooming in secret letters and longing glances, it still has to answer to a higher authority. One that frowns on kissing during Lent and really doesn't like it when you flirt near the relics. Welcome to the Church's grip on medieval romance. By the 12th century, the Christian Church, especially in Western Europe, had muscled its way into nearly every corner of people's romantic lives. Marriage, once a social contract between families, had become a sacrament, overseen by priests, governed by canon law, and surrounded by a thick tangle of do's and don'ts. Love was fine, but it had to come with paperwork, witticisms, and an acceptable moral trajectory. Otherwise, it was sin. Mainstream historical sources agree. The Church's rules around marriage and sexuality shaped how people fell in love, how they wed, and what happened if they crossed the line. Priests preached weekly about the dangers of lust. They warned against impure thoughts, condemned secret liaisons, and laid out strict guidelines about when and how married couples could, be together. Spoiler: not during fast days, feast days, Sundays, or if you were mad at each other, and definitely not during Advent or Lent. Basically, if you wanted to time it right, you needed a calendar, a penance chart, and maybe a miracle. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were uniformly enforced or more aspirational, like a parental bedtime rule. Everyone technically follows but breaks constantly. Parish priests knew their communities. In some places they turned a blind eye to youthful flirtations and quiet courtships, so long as scandal didn't erupt. In others they were strict enforcers, scolding lovers from the pulpit and assigning penance like it was candy at Easter, which by the way was also a restricted season for intimacy. One of the more fringe yet fascinating practices was the ban of marriage system. For 3 consecutive Sundays before a wedding, couples had to have their names read aloud during Mass. This wasn't a medieval RSVP, it was to give the community time to object. If someone knew a reason the marriage shouldn't happen, like the groom already being married to someone 2 villages over, this was their moment to speak up. Awkward, sure, but effective. Imagine standing in church as your cousin loudly accuses your future spouse of shady pig-related crimes. Congratulations, you're now trending in the village gossip mill. And it wasn't just the lead-up to marriage under scrutiny. Married life itself came with rules, many of them deeply theological. The Church viewed sex as a necessary evil, allowed only within marriage, and only if done properly, which excluded, well, a lot of creative possibilities. Even affection between spouses could be frowned upon if it was seen as overly passionate. Love was meant to be modest, controlled, and purpose-driven, preferably with the lights off and thoughts firmly fixed on your salvation. Confession played a huge role in policing these boundaries. People were expected to confess their romantic and sexual sins, including everything from lustful thoughts to actual acts. Some confessors were gentle, others asked pointed questions with alarming detail, scribbling notes like a medieval detective. Did you kiss her before or after the rooster crowed? Were you seated or standing? Did you never mind penance's 3 Hail Marys and a week of no meat? Clerical hypocrisy, of course, abounded. While priests weren't supposed to marry or have lovers, many did, especially in rural parishes where oversight was lax. Some kept housekeepers who mysteriously had the same jawline as the local curate. In towns, people winked and whispered about Father Thomas's nightly walks. Everyone knew, but few challenged it, unless politics got involved. And then there were the saints. Oh, the saints! Their stories were filled with extreme virtue and equally extreme reactions to temptation. One saint reportedly threw himself into a thorn bush every time he had a lustful thought. Another leapt into an icy river to cool his passions. While admirable in theory, these tales set some seriously unattainable goals. You're just trying to get through the day without staring at the blacksmith's forearms. And here's Saint So-and-so flinging himself off cliffs. Fringe detail: the church occasionally issued indulgences, remissions of punishment for people who made generous donations or went on pilgrimage. While not meant to excuse romantic sins, they were sometimes used that way. Yes, I kissed her behind the granary, but I did pay for that new candle holder in the apse. Whether this worked in the eyes of God is unclear, but it definitely worked in the eyes of the parish treasurer. Despite all these constraints, people found ways to express affection. Courting couples attended Mass together, sometimes exchanging glances during prayers. A man might accidentally sit too close at the public fountain. A girl might drop her kerchief in front of the person she liked. Twice, religious festivals ironically became prime spots for flirtation. Pilgrimages often turned into romantic adventures, with traveling companions growing close over the course of dusty miles and shared blisters. Still, the church kept trying to remind everyone, love is sacred, but it better follow the rules. Those who disobeyed could face public penance, excommunication, or social ruin. A few brave lovers defied it all, choosing passion over propriety, sneaking kisses under altars, and hiding love letters in hymnals. Some were caught, others weren't. The danger made it sweeter, because even in a world shadowed by doctrine and duty, the heart had its own commandments. Ones that didn't always fit in the church's tidy little scrolls. The confessional is dim and close, the air stale with old wood and whispered sins. A nervous voice stammers on the other side of the screen, confessing to thoughts, just thoughts, that a certain someone's arms looked a little too good during haymaking. The priest sighs, murmurs the usual penance, and maybe adds an extra prayer for good measure. Lust, after all, is no small matter in medieval Europe. It's one of the big 7, and it's everywhere. For a society obsessed with virtue, medieval Europe was surprisingly tangled up in desire. On one hand, you had a church preaching abstinence, penance, and eternal vigilance against temptation. On the other, you had people with eyes, impulses, and far too many feast days involving wine. Love, sex, and shame weren't separate experiences. They were braided together into one complex, often contradictory daily reality. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that medieval attitudes towards sex were built around strict Christian teachings. Sex was allowed only within marriage, and even then it had rules. It should be for procreation, not pleasure. It should be respectful, not passionate, and it definitely shouldn't happen on Sundays, feast days, during Lent or Advent, or when a woman was menstruating, pregnant, or nursing. Honestly, between all the restrictions, it's a miracle anyone managed to have children at all. Still, people did. And lots of them. Despite the church's best efforts, the average medieval person, noble or peasant, found ways to engage with their own sexuality, sometimes respectfully, sometimes secretly, sometimes in ways that made their confessors wish they'd taken a different career path. Historians still argue whether the majority of people followed these rules or mostly nodded along while doing whatever they pleased behind closed shutters. Evidence leans toward the latter. Court records, sermons, and confessional manuals show that violations of sexual norms were frequent and often predictable. Premarital sex, common. Adultery, risky but not rare. Lustful thoughts, Practically a national pastime, if some of these written pleas for forgiveness are anything to go by. One fringe tidbit: there were actual guidebooks written for confessors that detailed how to interrogate people about their sins, with uncomfortably precise questions. These manuals included instructions like, ask whether the sin was committed in the usual way or in a perverted manner, and determine if the partner was a relative, a member of the clergy, or livestock. Yes, that was in there. Moving on, these priests weren't just spiritual guides, they were walking HR departments for moral infractions. The heavy moral weight placed on sexuality led to all kinds of emotional gymnastics. Married couples, for instance, were often confused about what was allowed. Was it sinful to enjoy sex? To initiate it? To have it on Wednesday? Couples wrote to priests with these questions, and the answers, when they came, were not always reassuring. It is permitted, but dangerous, one cleric wrote, which is basically the theological version of proceed with caution. Side effects may include eternal damnation. But people didn't stop desiring, so they redirected. Poetry, music, embroidery, even religious art, often contained subtle or not so subtle expressions of longing. A chaste kiss in a stained glass window. A prayer that doubles as a love letter. A painting of a saint that looks suspiciously like the local blacksmith's daughter. Love, lust, and longing leaked out around the edges of piety. And when things crossed the line, confession was there. People confessed to everything. Kisses, touches, dreams, more than dreams. Some felt genuine guilt. Others simply wanted to avoid social shame or secure access to the sacraments. The act of confessing didn't just cleanse, it reset the board. One could sin, confess, perform penance, and return to daily life slightly more cautious, but no less human. Of course, not everyone confessed willingly. Public shaming, imposed penance, and worst of all, excommunication were on the table for serious offenders. But even then, the punishment often depended on status. A noble caught in adultery might receive a private scolding and a suggestion to donate a new church bell. A servant caught sneaking into someone's bedchamber could lose their job, their home, or worse. Justice, medieval style, never quite blind. Let's talk about celibacy. The church upheld virginity as the gold standard of virtue, especially for women. Maidens were idealized. Virgin martyrs were practically celebrities. Girls who entered convents were praised for choosing Christ over carnal love, which sounds romantic until you remember it usually involved a vow of silence and doing laundry for 50 years. Still, virginity wasn't always enforced equally. Noble families might guard a daughter's purity with locked towers and 12 cousins. But a peasant girl might be lucky to avoid scrutiny until her wedding day, when she had to prove it in increasingly uncomfortable ways. Remember the bedsheet tradition? Yeah, still awful. Despite all the pressure, love still snuck in. Secret trysts in stables, longing glances at the village well, a kiss under the wrong kind of tree. These weren't always grand romances. They were small rebellions against the endless chorus of thou shalt not. One especially poignant story comes from a medieval village in what is now Belgium. A young couple confessed, separately, to having fallen in love and touched each other without permission from God. They were sentenced to fast for 3 weeks, then marry immediately. At their wedding, the priest reportedly gave them a lecture so long the candles burned out. But they held hands the entire time, which, honestly, is kind of sweet. It's important to remember, people weren't just sinning, they were negotiating between their beliefs and their instincts, between church law and personal need, between shame and longing. Love wasn't a straight path. It was a maze, lined with commandments, steeped in guilt, but filled with real, beating hearts. Because even in a world where lust was labeled a sin and affection was whispered like a secret, people still found each other, and sometimes, despite everything, they even held on. The candle burns low as she sprinkles dried rose petals into a small linen pouch. She adds a pinch of rosemary, a feather from a hen that laid 2 eggs in one day, and a tiny carved token. Then she ties it tight and hides it beneath her mattress. Outside, the moon is full, perfect for enchantments. She murmurs a few words her grandmother taught her. Tomorrow, she plans to bump into that handsome cooper near the well. Will he notice her this time? He'd better. She's wearing her lucky amulet. In medieval Europe, when love wouldn't cooperate, or you needed a little divine push, people often turned to the stars, to charms, to herbs, or occasionally to a woman with a lot of cats and too many jars. Romance wasn't just about feelings, it was about fate, and when fate seemed slow to act, people got creative. Mainstream history usually paints the Middle Ages as deeply religious and deeply superstitious. And it's true, people believed in divine order, heavenly judgment, and saints who watched every sneeze. But that didn't stop them from consulting folk remedies or local wise women when they needed help with matters of the heart. Because sometimes, prayer just wasn't fast enough. One of the most enduring tools of love seekers was astrology. The stars weren't just twinkly lights, they were a cosmic calendar, believed to shape everything from crop yields to marital bliss. A medieval lover might visit an astrologer to determine the best time to confess their feelings, propose marriage, or even try for a child. The moon had its moods. Venus had her say. Mars, if involved, meant passion or disaster, depending on who you asked. Historians still argue how widespread astrological belief really was. Among the educated classes, astrology was often practiced alongside medicine and theology. Monks cast horoscopes, physicians consulted star charts, even popes dabbled. Among peasants, belief was less formal, more instinctive. If a cow wouldn't breed during a waning moon, what hope did a girl have of catching the miller's eye? One fringe tidbit: love magic wasn't always about attraction. Sometimes it was about protection. Women wore amulets made of herbs, bone, or copper, to ward off unwanted attention or to seal affection once gained. In Northern Europe, a popular charm involved sleeping with an apple under your pillow, then slicing it in half and sharing it with the object of your affection. If he accepted and didn't spit it out, success. If he spat, well, time to find another apple. Medieval love potions were a curious blend of botanical fact and hopeful fiction. Ingredients might include honey, wine, cinnamon, mint, nettle, and more questionable additions like powdered beetle shells, or let's just say, bodily materials best left unnamed. Did they work scientifically? Not likely, but the placebo effect is strong, and belief often made the difference. Plus a sweet-smelling drink in a world full of bad breath and cabbage soup, that alone was worth falling for. Men used magic too. A young man might inscribe a charm on a piece of lead, or carve symbols into the bark of a tree. One preserved love spell from 13th century Germany tells the reader to whisper a woman's name into a knot of hair, then bury it under a hawthorn bush during a thunderstorm. The goal: make her think of you constantly. The result: wet socks and a restraining order, probably, but they tried. These magical efforts existed in a strange grey space, technically frowned upon by the church, but not always condemned. As long as things didn't get too weird or too effective, local priests often let it slide. After all, it's hard to punish a girl for tying a ribbon around a candle and asking the Virgin Mary to make Thomas notice her braids. But sometimes, things escalated. A woman in 14th century France was accused of bewitching her neighbor's fiancé using enchanted flour. The case went to court. The flour, sadly, was just flour. She was fined, but not imprisoned. Her defense: I only meant for him to dream of me, not marry me. There's a difference, Your Honor. And not all magic was about attraction. Curses existed too. Jealous rivals, bitter exes, or overly concerned mothers might try to unbind a budding romance with protective prayers or darker mutterings. In some parts of Europe, love unbinding spells were whispered at crossroads or inscribed onto broken pottery and turned into rivers. Because if you couldn't have him, no one could. Medieval dating still slightly petty. Even clothing carried symbolic weight. Certain colors, red for desire, green for new love, were worn on purpose. A girl might stitch a secret sigil into her sleeve, or line her bodice with marjoram to keep wandering eyes at bay. Perfume didn't exist yet, at least not as we know it, but people still dabbed themselves with rosemary water or clove oil. Not just to smell nice, but to spark attraction. You may not have had soap, but at least you smelled faintly like ambition. And let's not forget dreams. Dreams were taken seriously, often believed to be messages from God, saints, or cosmic forces. Dreaming of a particular person too often, clearly a sign. Some people even slept with specific herbs under their pillows to induce romantic dreams. The medieval version of texting someone in your sleep. Oops, I dreamt about you again. Weird, right? Love magic and star lore weren't seen as foolish by most. They were tools in a world where love was uncertain, options were few, and emotions ran high, but opportunities to act on them were rare. A person might only get one real shot at marriage, and if sprinkling lavender on their doorstep helped, why not? Of course, none of these methods guaranteed success. Sometimes the stars were wrong. The potion tasted awful. The dream meant nothing. But even when they failed, the rituals themselves gave people comfort, a sense of control, a small hope, and sometimes the sheer effort was what made someone fall in love. You made a charm with beetle wings. For me, that's disgusting, but also kind of sweet. In the end, whether guided by the heavens or herbs, love was never just about chance. It was crafted, courted, conjured, and even if the charm wore off, even if the stars moved on, the longing remained, carved into bark, whispered into ribbons, and tucked beneath every straw pillow with fingers crossed. The flicker of a candle casts two shadows across the wall, two figures sitting a little too close, sharing warmth, silence, and something unspoken. Outside the cloister, the world buzzes with rules and roles, but here in the space between a hymn and a shared core, something tender grows. Is it friendship? Something more? Hard to say, harder still to admit, because in medieval Europe, affection between members of the same sex wasn't easily labeled, rarely safe, and always complicated. The modern language of identity didn't exist back then. There were no neat categories, no official terms for orientation or gender preference. But the emotions, the connections, the intense bonds that formed between people of the same sex, those absolutely existed, and they threaded through monasteries, convents, courts, villages, and armies like hidden embroidery, sometimes visible, sometimes not, but always there. Mainstream history tends to gloss over this. The focus stays on straight, marriage-bound relationships. But if you look closer at letters, legal cases, poetry, even church complaints, you find a different story. One of fierce devotion, whispered affection, and occasionally, dangerous desire. In convents and monasteries, same-sex closeness was common, and sometimes expected. Monks lived together, prayed together, bathed together. Nuns did the same. Deep emotional friendships called particular friendships were not only tolerated, but in some places encouraged. These bonds were spiritual, yes, but also deeply personal. Two monks might share a cell, two nuns might share a bed, not for reasons of passion, officially, but for warmth, safety, and emotional support. Still, lines blurred. The church noticed. Historians still argue whether these relationships were romantic or simply intimate, in a world starved for privacy and connection. Some insist they were chaste. Others point to passionate letters, eyewitness accounts, and a few too many stern sermons warning against unnatural affection. There's one especially famous letter from a French abbess to her companion that includes lines like, "My soul cannot bear your absence." Not exactly casual. Fringe detail. In 12th century England, there are court records mentioning two women who were accused of living as husband and wife. One even reportedly wore men's clothing and attempted to perform a marriage ceremony. The case was quickly buried, and the outcome remains unclear, but the fact that it was recorded at all suggests it wasn't isolated. Whispers spread. Some people noticed, others pretended not to. Among noblemen, same-sex bonds also ran deep, especially in knightly circles. Brotherhood, loyalty, and martial camaraderie were celebrated, often in flowery, emotionally charged language. Knights swore oaths to one another, exchanged tokens, and wrote letters filled with devotion. Again, were these just noble bromances, or something deeper? It depends whom you ask, and whether you're reading the censored version. Some medieval poetry reads like modern love songs. Take the Goliardic verses, Latin poems by wandering clerics, and students. While most are bawdy and satirical, a few express clear longing between men. One poem, often attributed to an anonymous 13th century student, describes another man's eyes as the stars that unmake my vows. Dramatic? Sure. Romantic? Almost certainly. And yet, the consequences of acting on these feelings could be severe. The Church condemned same-sex relations as sodomy, a term so broadly defined it included everything from erotic dreams to full-blown relationships. Punishments ranged from confession and fasting to public penance and execution. In some regions, particularly later in the Middle Ages, sodomy trials increased, and the stakes became dangerously high. Still, enforcement was inconsistent. In many villages, people likely turned a blind eye, especially if the relationship wasn't disruptive. The real trouble came when love crossed social lines, drew too much attention, or challenged gender roles. Two men living quietly together might be seen as odd but harmless. But if one tried to claim inheritance as a spouse, or a woman adopted male clothing to protect her lover, that could spark fury. And gender itself wasn't as rigid as we often think. Some medieval texts describe people who lived as a different gender from the one they were assigned. One remarkable case, from 14th century Spain, involves a person named Eleanor Reichner, who was arrested in London for sex work while dressed in women's clothing. During questioning, Reichner described having lived both as a man and a woman, engaging in relationships with men and women alike. The case file, preserved in court records, left judges baffled and modern scholars fascinated. Outside of religious or noble circles, same-sex affection took quieter forms. Two unmarried women might share a home, raising animals and looking after each other into old age. Were they friends, family, lovers? The community usually didn't ask. Sometimes it was easier not to. The same went for male duos, traveling tradesmen, lifelong apprentices, even soldiers who slept back-to-back under canvas tents and signed wills naming each other as heirs. Some of these relationships became legends. Others disappeared into the fabric of daily life, unspoken but deeply felt. One letter from a 15th century artisan to his dearest companion ends with the line, "If I could write what my heart feels, the ink would burn." That's not business talk. And yet, for all the silence and secrecy, these connections mattered. They provided warmth in cold winters, laughter in hard times, and a sense of belonging in a world that often pushed people into rigid molds. Love may not have worn the names we use now, but it lived quietly, powerfully, and sometimes against all odds. So no, medieval Europe wasn't full of openly LGBTQ+ identities the way we understand them today. But the feelings, the longing, the quiet acts of tenderness shared in kitchens, cloisters, fields, and forests, those were very real. Because even in a time of burning pyres and whispered suspicion, love found its corners, and sometimes, in the most unexpected places, it bloomed anyway. The hall is buzzing. Tables creak under the weight of meat pies, roasted roots, and jugs of wine slightly more vinegary than anyone admits. A fiddler tunes up near the hearth. Somewhere, a girl adjusts her wreath of ivy, cheeks already flushed, not from the fire, but from who she's spotted across the room. This is no ordinary night. It's the spring festival, and in medieval Europe, that meant one thing: music, dance, and the sweetest, most strategic chance to flirt in full daylight without getting smacked by a priest. While church calendars ruled most of the year with solemnity and fasting, certain feast days, especially seasonal festivals, gave communities permission to celebrate, eat, sing, and yes, get a little silly. These events weren't just religious obligations. They were rare social windows where romance could stretch its limbs and poke its head out from behind a bushel of apples. Mainstream history paints a vivid picture of these gatherings. May Day, for instance, was practically Cupid's playground. People danced around maypoles, sang bawdy songs, and paired off for games in the woods that conveniently didn't require adult supervision. Local clergy tried to limit the mischief, but the woods kept happening. So did the games. Music was central. Minstrels, pipers, drummers, and fiddlers turned village squares into rhythmic, swirling circles of movement. Group dances, like the carol or branlo, were designed to involve everyone. You'd hold hands, switch partners, and step in time with the beat. Not only was it fun, but it was one of the few socially acceptable ways to touch someone who wasn't your spouse. If your hand lingered a little too long, or you misstepped into someone's arms, well, the music made a convenient excuse. Historians still argue whether these dances were simply innocent fun or covert matchmaking rituals. Some believe communities used them to encourage couples to form naturally before parental arrangements kicked in. Others see them as tension releases, safe zones for young people to mingle under the watchful gaze of neighbors pretending not to watch. Either way, many marriages can trace their origins to a stolen laugh during a soggy spring bran. And not just spring, winter feasts, especially during Yuletide, also brought opportunities. Mistletoe, for example, wasn't just a pretty plant. In some regions, kissing under it was more than a game. It was a promise. Some believed that a kiss beneath mistletoe meant the couple would marry within a year or risk bad luck, which might explain why people stood under it for suspiciously long stretches. One delightful fringe detail: in parts of medieval Wales and Brittany, there were love riddles performed at feasts. Think of them as flirty musical duels. A man might sing a playful challenge, and a woman would respond with a clever retort, often turning his rhyme upside down. It wasn't just about wit, it was about chemistry. The best pairs could leave a room roaring with laughter, or whispering afterward. Of course, not everyone was smooth. Dancing, especially, could be a battlefield of nerves. Some young men dreaded being chosen by bold girls. One scribe wrote about a festival where a boy tried to hide behind a goose pen to avoid dancing, only to be dragged out by two determined cousins. He danced poorly. They laughed. He later married one of them. True love is sometimes sweaty and full of goose feathers. Costumes also played a role. During festivals, people often dressed in symbolic colors or donned garlands. Red signified passion. White meant virtue. Green, especially in spring, meant fertility, or at least optimism. A boy wearing green and red was basically declaring, "I'm looking for love, and I'm not subtle." Some girls embroidered secret symbols into their sleeves to signal availability, though decoding them was its own challenge. A fern meant caution, a daisy meant hope, a thistle probably meant don't try it. The church tried to rein in some of these customs, especially those it deemed too pagan or too frisky. Dancing in churchyards was banned in many areas. Songs were vetted. Clergy gave fiery sermons warning against lust disguised as laughter. But people needed joy. They needed connection. And once the harvest was in or the sheep were shorn, they deserved a night to feel alive. In many places, villages hosted mock courts of love during festivals. These weren't legally binding, of course, but they were hilarious and wildly popular. A queen of love would be chosen, usually the prettiest girl not already married, and she'd sit in judgment over pretend cases of heartbreak and romantic misdeeds. Did Thomas promise to marry Marjorie and then dance with Joan? Was Agnes guilty of stealing Roger's ribbon? Bring it before the love court. Verdicts were light-hearted, sometimes involving kisses, songs, or harmless tasks. But everyone paid attention, and gossip, oh, it flourished. Music also carried coded messages. Some songs were designed for public performance, but others were more personal, ballads, with hidden meanings, sung softly under windows, or hummed near a well. Lovers developed their song, passed through generations like emotional heirlooms. One melody found in multiple 14th century manuscripts contains lyrics about a shoemaker's daughter who refuses every suitor except the one who can dance without stumbling. We can only assume that's a metaphor, probably. These moments, woven through feast days, market celebrations, and holy holidays, offered more than fun. They were lifelines. In a world where love was often arranged, prescribed, or forbidden, festivals gave people a rare chance to choose, even if it was just for a night. And sometimes, that night led to more. A touch during a dance, a shared joke during a torchlit parade, a kiss under mistletoe that turned into a lifetime of muddy boots and laughter over porridge. Not every festival fling became a fairy tale, but for a moment, love stepped out of the shadows and joined the dance. Because even in a world ruled by kings and commandments, music made room for hearts to wander. She sits on a low stool, counting coins into a small leather pouch. 1, 2, 3, 4 silver pennies. Behind her, A bundle of wool blankets hides a carved box filled with her dowry, linens stitched by her mother, a worn bronze brooch, a flagon from her grandmother's wedding, and 2 goats that, if all goes well, will stay alive long enough to impress someone. She doesn't know yet if love is in her future. But money, that's already involved. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just a union of hearts, it was a merger of assets. The dowry, that infamous collection of wealth a bride brought into a marriage, could make or break a match. It wasn't just tradition, it was strategy, currency, leverage, and it spoke volumes about status, value, and expectations, even when the couple was actually in love. Mainstream history is clear. Dowries were central to most marriages across medieval Europe, from noble courts to farming villages. The wealthier the family, the higher the stakes. Land, gold, livestock, even whole manors could be exchanged to secure a bride's future and her family's reputation. For middle-class and poorer families, the dowry might consist of household goods, tools, or future promises. You'll get the cow when it calves. What counted as a good dowry varied wildly. In one corner of Italy, silk bedsheets and a silver belt might seal the deal. In a French village, 3 chickens and a well-made spinning wheel might suffice. It all came down to local custom, available resources, and whether the bride's family had any leverage. Hint, if she had a brother, they probably didn't, and that's where things got awkward. Families often went into debt just to scrape together a respectable dowry. Daughters were married off in order of financial feasibility, not age or affection. One sister might wed at 16 with a full linen chest and a barrel of wine. Another might wait until her 20s, when the sheep finally cooperated. Love took a back seat to arithmetic. Historians still argue whether the dowry system protected women or commodified them. On one hand, a decent dowry could secure a better match and give a woman status in her new household. On the other, it reduced her to a balance sheet, a vessel with a price tag, and heaven help the girl with no dowry at all. She had 3 options: become a nun, work in someone else's household, or hope for a miracle, or a bachelor who was really bad with math. Fringe detail? In some cities, like Florence and Venice, the dowry system became so burdensome that communal dowry funds were established. These were early financial institutions backed by civic or religious bodies that allowed families to invest in their daughter's future by paying in over time. Think of it as a medieval college savings account, but with more goats and fewer scholarships. Noble families, of course, played by their own rules. Dowries at that level weren't just family matters, they were political statements. A duchess marrying a count might bring entire territories with her. One French princess's dowry included rights to a salt mine and half of a disputed river. Romance. Not exactly, but the wedding feast was probably amazing. Among peasants, dowries were simpler, but no less stressful. A girl might bring a piglet, some seed grain, a woven blanket, and a promise from her uncle to help patch the roof. Modest, yes, but enough to set up a life. In some cases, a man marrying a woman with a small but functional dowry would agree to provide tools or livestock in return. It was less love conquers all, and more if you bring the goat, I'll build the pen. But what happened when things went wrong? If the husband died, the dowry was meant to return to the wife, or at least remain available for her use. In theory, in reality, in-laws often tried to keep it, claiming it had merged with the household. Cue legal disputes, awkward family dinners, and the occasional clergy intervention. A widow with a good dowry might remarry quickly. One without, she might end up on the charity list or move back in with her brother and try not to look resentful. One especially messy case from 13th century England involved a dowry dispute that lasted longer than the marriage itself. The bride's father claimed he was promised a cow and a cart. The groom's family insisted it was just the cow. The couple separated after 2 weeks. The court sided with the cow. The cart remains lost to history. And it wasn't just about the women. A poorly chosen dowry could ruin a man's finances. If a bride's family overpromised or lied about her portion, her new husband might find himself drowning in debts or forced to renegotiate land with furious uncles. In some German towns, couples included clauses in their marriage contracts, allowing for dowry audits. Romantic, right? Yet, for all the complexity and anxiety, dowries weren't always cold transactions. Sometimes they were lovingly assembled, passed down through generations, imbued with hope and meaning. A mother might sew her wedding dress into a blanket. A grandmother's comb might be polished and passed along with a quiet blessing. One couple in France reportedly inscribed their names into a wooden bowl that had been part of the bride's dowry, used daily until the day they died. Call it practical sentimentality. Interestingly, dowries didn't always go into the marriage. In rare cases, women who remained unmarried, especially wealthy or noble women, used their dowry funds to support charities, found convents or fund pilgrimages. Some became abbesses or estate managers, wielding power in ways no marriage would have allowed. It wasn't the typical path, but it was a powerful one. Ultimately, the dowry system was both obstacle and opportunity, a financial burden that in the right circumstances could open doors. But it always loomed over medieval love stories, quietly asking, "How much are you worth?" And sometimes the answer was, just enough. Enough to start a life. Enough to hold hands at the harvest dance. Enough to make a marriage that mattered, chickens and all. The village bell rings in the distance, muffled under the weight of smoke. The air smells of ash and vinegar, and no one touches each other anymore, not even for greetings. Doors stay shut. Markets are quiet. In the corner of a stone house, a woman clutches a sprig of dried sage and prays over a cracked window pane. She hasn't seen her sweetheart in 3 weeks. Not since the cart came for his family. Love, it seems, has fled along with everything else. But even in the shadow of death, it still stirs. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe like a scythe. By the time it subsided, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population was gone. Cities were hollowed out, villages vanished, graves multiplied. But while plague reshaped everything, economy, faith, politics, it also changed the way people approached love, courtship, and marriage. Because when tomorrow is not guaranteed, feelings become urgent, kisses get quicker, proposals bolder, and promises take on new meaning. Mainstream historical records show that after each major wave of plague, particularly the first, from 1347 to 1351, marriage rates surged. Widows remarried quickly. Young people married younger. Couples who might have waited suddenly didn't. The risk of dying alone was real and immediate, and affection that had simmered for years could erupt overnight. And not all unions were motivated by panic. Some were sparked by shared survival. Two people who had nursed the same sick relative, helped bury neighbors, or simply found each other alive when so many others weren't. These bonds ran deep. Loss made love stronger, stranger, and sometimes faster. Historians still argue whether these plague marriages were more impulsive or more sincere than peacetime unions. Some scholars suggest that in a world stripped of ceremony and social niceties, people made decisions from the gut. Others argue that traditional structures still held arranged matches, dowries, family influence, but were sped up or carried out under modified terms. Either way, the plague created an emotional pressure cooker, and romance didn't vanish. It adapted. One fringe tidbit. In certain towns, a bizarre form of deathbed betrothal gained traction. If a dying person was unmarried, family or clergy might hastily arrange a symbolic marriage, sometimes with another terminally ill person. The idea was to help them die, complete in the eyes of the church. Occasionally, it was also about property, ensuring inheritance stayed in family hands. Either way, it meant that someone's first kiss might also be their last breath. Grim? Yes, but also strangely tender, of course. Not all romances were noble. With so many dead, labor became scarce. That meant upward mobility for survivors, and in some cases, new power dynamics in courtship. A former servant might suddenly have land. A tenant might marry a lord's daughter when heirs were thin on the ground. Social climbing through love became more plausible, and sometimes more cutthroat. There are records of entire marriage contracts rewritten post-plague, dowries waived or doubled, and unions arranged in days rather than years. The church did its best to maintain rituals, but priests were dying too, by the hundreds. So were monks, nuns, scribes, and notaries. In many places, Marriages were performed without banns or formal ceremony. A couple might exchange vows in a garden, a barn, or at the foot of a plague cross, with no one present but two coughing witnesses. And sometimes, not even them. And there was dark humor too. One peasant joke preserved in a 14th century manuscript reads, "The plague took my cow and my cousin, but not my wife. God clearly wants me miserable." Rough crowd. But the laughter, however bleak, helped. Yet love in plague time was not always tragic. There were stolen moments of beauty. A poem scratched onto a piece of bark and left on a doorstep. A loaf of bread secretly shaped into a heart. A glove passed through a shutter crack. People found ways to reach each other, softly, creatively, defiantly. One documented case from Avignon describes a couple who were engaged before the outbreak, but separated during quarantine. When they finally reunited, they found their entire families gone, with no priest nearby. They declared their vows privately and considered themselves married. A year later, when the church reopened, they remarried officially. The priest reportedly wept through the whole ceremony, which in medieval terms means someone might have written a ballad about it. Let's talk superstition. Plague-era lovers turned to all kinds of rituals for protection. Some wore love charms soaked in vinegar, others hung herbs over doorways, not just to ward off disease, but to protect their relationships. One peculiar practice in parts of Eastern Europe involved tying locks of hair together and burying them under a tree. The belief that as long as the tree lived, so would the love. A few of those trees, reportedly, still stand. Yet despite everything, the death, the fear, the chaos, love refused to vanish. In fact, it clung even harder to life. Because when the world ends for half the people you know, the small, human acts become sacred. A warm hand, a shared bowl, a whispered promise, in the dark. But the toll was undeniable. Some lovers never reunited. Some carried grief like an extra limb. And some, having loved and lost, never tried again. Their names faded from parish records, but occasionally reappear in old letters, where someone writes, "She was promised to me, but the fever came," or, "He said he'd return in the spring. He did not." And so, through masks of cloth and smoke of burning herbs, people still found each other, not because they ignored the plague, but because they needed love more than ever, not as a cure, but as a reason to keep going. And maybe, just maybe, they still wanted you. Because even as bells tolled endlessly for the dead, there was always someone listening for a different sound. The knock at the door, the quiet footstep returning, the voice that meant someone had survived. Elopement was more than a dramatic act of defiance. It was sometimes the only option for couples denied permission to marry. Strict social boundaries, arranged matches, or lack of dowry could block even the most determined pair. So they ran over hills, through forests, to the next parish or the next country. Anywhere they could find a priest, a sympathetic witness, or at least a barn to catch their breath in. Romantic or criminal, that depended heavily on who you asked. And when you asked them, the moon is full, the cart is ready, and the road out of town is blessedly empty. Two figures hurry past the sleeping chickens and the slumped form of a snoring watchman. One carries a bundle of clothes, the other, a heart full of panic and excitement. They climb into the cart, whisper something that sounds like, "Go," and vanish into the night. Congratulations, you've just witnessed an elopement, or possibly a kidnapping. In medieval Europe, the line was often distressingly thin. Mainstream historical accounts document a surprising number of elopements, especially in the later Middle Ages when individual consent began to carry more legal weight. According to church doctrine, two people of legal age could declare themselves married by mutual consent. No priest, no feast, no fancy parchment required. This loophole became a lifeline for love-struck runaways. But here's where it gets messy. Not all elopements were voluntary. Historians still argue about the prevalence of marriage by abduction. Yes, actual kidnapping. In some areas, it was horrifyingly common for a man to take a woman against her will and force her into marriage. Sometimes he'd claim her as a bride and seal the deal by consummating the union. Often the law took his side if he married her afterward. Why? Because once married she was considered his property. and because honor could allegedly be restored by a wedding vow, even if it had been violently breached. Fringe detail: in Ireland and the Scottish Highlands, there were regional traditions of marriage by capture, some of which may have originated as ritualized performances, but were occasionally practiced for real. One custom involved staging a mock abduction of the bride to represent her transition from maidenhood to married life. The trouble came when mock became not so mock. Some families played along. Others grabbed pitchforks. Church courts were frequently called upon to sort out these tangled cases. Was the bride willing? Were the vows freely given? Was there a witness? Did the man already have another wife in a different town? These weren't theoretical questions. One record from 15th century England shows a woman testifying that her groom had gagged her during the ceremony, which did not meet the freely given standard. He was fined. She was declared unmarried, and the priest fined too for going along with it. Still, not all runaway marriages were sinister. Many were born from genuine desperation. A couple forbidden to marry due to class, money, or family feuds might flee together and trust the church to clean up the paperwork later. One particularly charming case from France involves a miller's daughter and a visiting merchant's apprentice. They slipped away during a village feast, left a note, and returned 2 years later with a baby, a recipe for almond bread, and absolutely no regrets. Among the nobility, elopements could cause full-blown scandals, sometimes wars. A noblewoman running off with the wrong man might bring shame, lawsuits, or broken alliances. A famous case involved Marjorie Paston, an English gentlewoman who married her family's steward against their wishes. Her relatives disapproved so fiercely they tried to have the marriage annulled. But Marjorie, stubborn and articulate, fought back in writing. Her love letters still survive, full of affection, sarcasm, and shade. She won, so did love, rare but satisfying. Meanwhile, some couples eloped without leaving home. They simply stood in a field, declared their vows, and hoped no one objected before the priest made it official. This practice, known as clandestine marriage, was technically legal under church law, but wildly unpopular with families who wanted control, witnesses, and a say in the guest list. Clandestine marriages often forced relatives to accept unions they never approved of, especially once there was a baby involved. Legal debates around consent were evolving, especially by the later Middle Ages. Canon law increasingly emphasized that both parties had to agree to the union. This offered some women a way out, but only if they had allies or evidence. In isolated villages, where the groom's cousin was the constable and the priest owed him a chicken, outcomes weren't always so favorable. The motivations behind these flights were as varied as the people themselves. For some, it was the thrill. For others, necessity. Some had no other option. A few just wanted to make a point, but all of them gambled. On timing, on forgiveness, on love, outpacing scandal. One fringe example. In the town of Bergen, a couple married secretly under a tree and celebrated by sharing an apple. They told no one. Months later, when challenged in court, they cited the apple as symbolic proof. The judge, reportedly confused but impressed, ruled in their favor. And let's not forget the more performative end of the spectrum. Dramatic public elopements. Some couples used feasts or festivals as cover, slipping away during the revelry. Others staged distractions. In one recorded case, a boy released a flock of chickens into the village square, while his sister ran off with her blacksmith sweetheart. Classic misdirection. Because sometimes to win at love in the Middle Ages, you had to risk the road, the law, and a good pair of boots. Of course, not every runaway romance ended well. Some were caught, some annulled, some forgotten. But others turned into long, quiet marriages, full of shared bread, morning chores, and whispered stories about that night, that cart, that mood. She didn't want to marry him. He didn't even know her name. But there she was, veiled and silent, standing beside him as the priest began the Latin vows. She glanced once toward the corner where her mother clutched a rosary and avoided her gaze. The wine had already been poured, the gifts exchanged, the wedding feast was heating up. Consent? Well, that part was assumed. Mainstream history acknowledges that forced marriages were not the rule, but they were far from rare, especially among the nobility, where dynastic goals often trumped personal feelings. Girls could be married off at startlingly young ages to men they'd never met. Sometimes the bride was too young to understand what was happening. Sometimes she understood all too well and had no way to stop it. In medieval Europe, the idea of willing marriage was something of a moving target. While the church eventually recognized that both bride and groom had to freely consent for a marriage to be valid, the definition of free could be flexible, especially if strong wine, stronger parents, or local politics were involved. The result, a surprising number of marriages sealed by force, fraud, or fire. But forced marriages weren't confined to the elite. Among peasants, family pressure, debts, land disputes, or social expectations could push two people together, whether they liked it or not. Saying no wasn't always an option, and once the vows were said, or mumbled under duress, it was nearly impossible to reverse them without a lengthy church process and a very persuasive case. Historians still argue where to draw the line between persuasion and coercion. A bride who cried at the altar, was she nervous or terrified? A groom who stood in silence, was he shy or trapped? Without clear legal standards and with plenty of room for manipulation, these lines blurred fast. What counted was that the marriage looked proper, especially if there were witnesses, food, and a priest willing to shrug. Fraud was another route to unwanted unions. People pretended to be richer than they were. Dowries were exaggerated. Priests were bribed or tricked. There's a documented case of a man marrying a woman using a false name, only to be exposed a week later when his other wife showed up from 2 villages over. He was fined. The second marriage was annulled. The first wife probably got a lot of satisfaction from telling everyone, "I told you so." One fringe tale from 14th century Spain involves a girl who protested her wedding by biting the groom's hand during the ceremony. The priest declared it non-consensual. The groom bled. The girl ran off. No word on what became of her, but the incident made its way into parish gossip and at least 2 bad poems. And then there were marriages sealed through trickery or staged situations. A favorite of folktales and actual court records involves someone getting their crush drunk and coaxing out vows they didn't mean. Technically, saying "I take you as my spouse" in front of witnesses was enough for a legal marriage. Add a few goblets of wine and a well-timed "say it again louder," and suddenly your cousin wakes up married to the pig farmer. Even worse, some communities treated physical consummation as evidence of consent. If a couple spent the night together, willingly or not, pressure to marry often followed. The church, believing that sex should only occur within marriage, preferred to legitimize the situation rather than deal with scandal, which led to some dark outcomes. A man might force himself on a woman, then offer to marry her as penance. She could say no, but that often meant shame, poverty, and social ruin. And yet, the church didn't always side with the aggressor. In several well-documented cases, marriages were annulled because one party had clearly been coerced. One young woman in England claimed her uncle forced her into marriage by threatening to kill her pet dog. Sounds absurd now, but the church took her seriously. The marriage was annulled. The uncle was fined. The dog, presumably, got extra scraps. Still, not all medieval marriages were traps or jokes. Plenty were chosen, cherished, and celebrated. But the existence of so many cases of manipulation, fraud, and force speaks to a culture where marriage was less about personal happiness and more about alliances, inheritance, and appearances. Love might follow, but it certainly wasn't required to show up on time. In response to such chaos, the church tightened procedures over time. By the 13th century, public bans were required. Announcements read aloud for 3 Sundays before a wedding. This gave the community time to object, reveal secrets, or prepare properly. But even this system had loopholes. People eloped to skip the bans. Priests performed quiet ceremonies for the right bribe. And once the marriage was consummated, it was nearly impossible to undo. On the flip side of the grim coin were the farcical unions, marriages that started as jokes, dares, or performances, and accidentally became real. Think of it as the "oops, we're legally wed" trope of the 1300s. One famous case from the Low Countries involves a pair of drunk students who staged a fake wedding to entertain their friends. Vows were spoken, hands clasped, a priest impersonated. The next morning, someone realized the priest was actually ordained. Surprise, you're married. In the end, marriage in the Middle Ages was a performance, a transaction, and occasionally a trapdoor. Whether by love, luck, or legal wrangling, couples landed in it one way or another. One last fringe note, there were trials where witnesses were called not just to confirm a wedding took place, but to testify about facial expressions. Did the bride look happy? Did the groom blink twice before answering? Was anyone holding a knife near the cake? These were genuine legal considerations, because consent mattered, but proving it was another story. And for some, climbing back out was the hard part. When we think of royal romance, we often imagine epic ballads, dramatic vows, and tragic ends. And while those existed, did they exist? The reality was often more like reality TV, with more velvet and fewer commercials. Behind every noble wedding and princely affair was a web of spies, informants, arranged matches, strategic mistresses, and whispered threats. Love wasn't just risky, it was weaponized. Mainstream history confirms that marriages among royalty and nobility were tools of diplomacy, control, and succession. Who you married could mean peace or war, trade or embargo, legitimacy or rebellion. But what people did after the wedding, that's where things got interesting. The court is glittering, the air thick with perfume, candle smoke, and the sharp scent of ambition. Laughter rises from a corner where a cluster of nobles trades witticisms and gossip like currency. Near the dais, a queen sips from a jeweled cup, while her husband pretends not to notice the duke whispering in her ear. And on the gallery above, a servant listens quietly, memorizing everything. In the grand courts of medieval Europe, love was never just personal, it was political, and absolutely no one was safe. Affairs in royal courts were both expected and explosive. Kings had mistresses, queens had favorites, nobles flirted, seduced, betrayed, and occasionally got themselves locked in towers for their efforts. Yet the very architecture of the court encouraged intimacy, shared meals, long banquets, dancing, and endless time to loiter in corridors lined with tapestries, thick enough to muffle even the juiciest secrets. Historians still argue how common these dalliances really were. Some claim most were exaggerated by gossip. Others point to endless letters, confessions, and suspiciously timed friendships to say otherwise. What's clear is that love, real or faked, was used as a ladder. A well-placed affair could raise your family's fortunes overnight, and the fall, if you slipped, was steep. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some royal courts employed bedchamber keepers, whose actual job was to manage who got access to the royal sleeping quarters. That didn't just mean fluffing pillows, it meant monitoring unofficial visitors. Want to sneak a note to the Queen's lady-in-waiting? You'd better get past a guy who literally gets paid to know where everyone is at bedtime. But queens weren't passive. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Catherine de Medici, and Isabella of France all wielded soft power in their own ways. Some formed intimate alliances with favored courtiers. Others used flirtation to gather information or distract enemies. And while proving a queen's affair was difficult, high treason, after all, was on the table. Rumors were enough to damage reputations and derail political plans. Even lower-tier nobles played the game. In the English court of Edward I, a lady-in-waiting named Jane Shore rose to prominence through a royal affair, then maintained influence with Edward's brother. She was eventually accused of sorcery to seduce men, code for she was too clever for comfort. She survived, barely, and became one of the era's most whispered about women. Let's not forget the official mistresses. In France, particularly under the later Valois and Bourbon kings, royal mistresses had official titles, apartments, and budgets. They influenced fashion, policy, and sometimes, allegedly, foreign negotiations. One of the most famous, Agnes Sorel, was said to have introduced a new style of low-cut gowns. The clergy protested. The king, not so much. The court was full of spies, servants, scribes, even musicians, who reported back to powerful figures. A poem left in a book, a locked drawer, opened too easily, a single flower exchanged during a dance, all could become evidence. Sometimes false evidence. Faking a love letter to sabotage a rival wasn't just possible, it was encouraged by people who wanted that next promotion, land grant or royal favor. And the clergy. They were in on it too. Court confessors heard everything. Some kept secrets, others passed them along, carefully, to bishops or nobles who paid in silver or influence. There's a documented case of a priest blackmailing a noblewoman over her affair with a page. He got a new chapel out of it. She got very good at lying during communion. Historians note that love letters from the courts were often written in coded language, puns, double meanings, literary references. One countess sent her lover a baked apple with a note referencing a scene from the Roman Della Rose. Another knight sent verses that used bird calls as metaphors for their meetings. The nightingale sings twice, but only after dark. We see you, Sir Subtle. But love in these spaces wasn't always cynical. Real affection did grow among the roses and power plays. Some royal couples genuinely adored each other. King Richard II is believed to have deeply loved his queen, Anne of Bohemia. When she died, he ordered the destruction of the palace where she passed. Other nobles wrote poetry to spouses, built chapels in their honor, or died defending their honor in tournaments that began with innocent flirtation and ended in hospital-grade jousting injuries. And some court affairs ended with real consequences. A nobleman, in Burgundy, caught in bed with a duke's niece, was blinded, not killed, just partially disabled. The message was clear: love as you please, but don't get caught. Or more accurately, get caught by someone who likes you. One final fringe detail: some courts kept love tokens as evidence. A dropped glove, a torn bit of ribbon, a poem scrawled on the back of a chessboard. These were stored, sometimes for years, in secret boxes by jealous rivals or sentimental courtiers. Love, in these cases, had a paper trail, and those papers could either start a marriage or start a war. Because in medieval courts, romance was never private. Every glance was currency, every smile had strategy, and every kiss left a shadow that someone somewhere was keeping a record of. The chill of a stone chamber seeps into bones and thoughts alike. Candles gutter, casting trembling shadows on walls lined with heavy tapestries and dusty tomes. Here scholars pore over texts in Latin and vernacular, debating the nature of love, sin and desire. The medieval world wasn't just about knights and peasants. It was also a place where ideas about romance, marriage, and gender were fiercely contested, shaped by theology, philosophy, and sometimes downright gossip. Medieval thinkers, clergy, poets, and philosophers wrestled with love's many faces. Was it divine or devilish, noble or base, something to be embraced or fought? Their answers didn't come neatly. Instead, they created a complex tapestry of ideas that influenced how people saw themselves and each other. Mainstream history tells us that the Church's teachings dominated this conversation. St. Augustine's idea that lust was a disordered desire shaped attitudes for centuries. Love was good only when aligned with reason and God's will. Anything else was a dangerous distraction. But alongside this strict view, there was also the idea of courtly love, a more romantic, even mystical concept that celebrated longing, devotion, and sometimes unrequited passion. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile these views. For him, love had multiple levels, from the selfless love of God, caritas, to the more human affection, amor. Marriage, he argued, was not just a legal contract, but a sacrament that sanctified love and desire, so long as it was ordered rightly. If love became selfish or purely physical, it threatened the soul. Historians still debate how much these high ideas filtered down to everyday people. Did a peasant couple think in Thomistic terms? Probably not, but the clergy's sermons, religious dramas, and public rituals infused communities with these concepts, shaping what was seen as proper behavior and what wasn't. The ideal of pure, chaste, and sanctified love was powerful, even if real life often fell short. Fringe tidbit: some medieval love manuals, written by monks and priests, were surprisingly practical and occasionally hilarious. One 13th century text offers advice on how to woo a woman, Be patient, bring gifts, praise her virtues, and don't ask for sex too soon. It also warns men not to be too eager or too slow, or risk losing her. The manual goes on to describe signs that a woman might be interested, such as blushing, lowering her eyes, or asking about your family. Modern dating apps. Take note. Poets, too, wrestled with love's contradictions. The troubadours sang of passion as both blissful and torturous. Their verses captured the thrill of a glance, the agony of rejection, and the ecstasy of union, but they also hinted at the dangers. Jealousy, betrayal, heartbreak. Love was a double-edged sword. And then there were the debates about gender roles. The medieval world was deeply patriarchal, but love sometimes blurred boundaries. Female saints who rejected marriage were praised for their spiritual strength. Noble women who negotiated marriages or wielded influence at court challenged male dominance. And stories of women who disguised themselves as men to pursue love or adventure cropped up in popular tales. Historians still argue about how common these transgressions were versus how much they were fantasy or propaganda. One intriguing example is the legend of La Dame Blanche, the White Lady, a mysterious figure said to appear in various European regions. Sometimes a ghost, sometimes a guardian, sometimes a lover. She embodies the tensions between desire and virtue, visibility and secrecy. Scholars debate whether she represents real women who defied norms, or is purely symbolic. Even the concept of friendship was entwined with love. Medieval text sometimes describe friendships between same-sex individuals in language that blurs emotional and physical boundaries. Were these purely platonic, romantic, something in between? The answer remains elusive and fascinating. All these ideas were not just academic. They shaped rituals, expectations, and personal choices. They influenced how weddings were celebrated, how confessions were given, and how love letters were written. Love wasn't just felt, it was thought about, argued over, and codified. The medieval mind saw love as a powerful force, capable of elevating the soul or dragging it into ruin. A force that needed to be balanced with duty, faith, and reason. And as people navigated the uncertainties of their lives, they turned to these ideas for guidance, comfort, and sometimes permission. Because love, in all its messy glory, demanded both passion and prudence, and the medieval world was nothing if not a place of contradictions. A dusty road stretches out beneath a blood-orange sunset. A lone traveler, cloak pulled tight, eyes scanning the horizon, walks toward an uncertain future. Behind them lies the safety of home, ahead the wild unknown. This is the story of the medieval soldier's love, a love forged on the battlefield, shaped by absence, longing, and the brutal reality of war. For many men in medieval Europe, soldiering was a way of life, not a career choice, but a duty. They marched across continents, fought in sieges, and endured months or years away from family and hearth. And while swords clashed and banners waved, hearts ached. Love was not left behind. It was carried in letters, dreams, and the hope of return. Mainstream history notes that soldiers' marriages were often arranged before deployment. Wives were expected to manage estates, raise children, and wait faithfully. But the reality was messier. Long separations led to loneliness, temptation, and sometimes betrayal. Letters from the front express longing and frustration. Women's accounts reveal resilience, and occasionally suspicion. Historians still debate the impact of military life on marriage stability. Some argue that prolonged absence weakened bonds, leading to desertion or remarriage. Others highlight the strong sense of duty and community support that helped maintain connections. The truth probably lies somewhere in the muddy fields where battles were fought. A fascinating fringe detail involves war brides who accompanied armies, women who served as cooks, laundresses, or nurses, and sometimes became companions or lovers of soldiers. These relationships were often informal, precarious, and complicated by social status. One chronicler described a camp where a laundress was considered as important as a knight for morale, and as likely to be the target of gossip. Soldiers also carried tokens of love, pieces of cloth, carved wood, or pressed flowers to remind them of home. These small objects were treasured and often described in poetry or song. One 14th-century ballad tells of a knight who carried a lady's glove in his helmet, until it fell apart. The gesture was both symbolic and practical, a shield against despair. Distance also inspired innovations in communication. Though letters were slow and often lost, couples developed codes, special phrases, symbols, or drawings to express affection discreetly. Sometimes a letter contained a hidden poem written in the margins, readable only by the intended recipient. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were, but surviving examples hint at a rich, secretive emotional life. And then there's the battlefield itself, a place where love and violence collided. Tales survive of soldiers making vows to return to their sweethearts, or marrying quickly before battle. Some promised to build chapels or fund masses for their beloved souls. Others left instructions for care of their families, highlighting the precariousness of life and love. The church encouraged soldiers to marry before war, emphasizing the sacramental nature of marriage as a protection for both spouses and a guarantee of legitimate heirs. But it also urged restraint, discouraging relations with camp followers and warning against adultery. Enforcement was patchy. Some priests served alongside troops, offering confession and counsel. Others were far away, leaving soldiers to their own devices. Stories of wartime infidelity are as common as those of devotion. A chronicler recounts a knight who caught his wife consorting with his squire during his absence. The punishment was severe, but the emotional damage was deeper. Yet even in betrayal, forgiveness sometimes prevailed. Letters suggest that some couples reconciled, their love tempered by hardship. The soldier's return was often a bittersweet event. Joy mingled with uncertainty. Had time changed them? Had promises been kept? Villagers prepared feasts and celebrations, but some arrivals were met with silence or distance. The psychological toll of war, scar, trauma, loss, affected not just bodies but relationships. One poignant anecdote tells of a soldier who returned after years, only to find his wife remarried. Instead of anger, he blessed her new union and left quietly, carrying his memories and the love that had sustained him through battle. Historians still argue about the prevalence of such stories, fact, fiction, or hopeful fiction. War's disruption also affected children, some born in the soldier's absence, others raised by extended family. Guardianship disputes and inheritance battles became common, entwining love with law and legacy. Yet, amid all this, love endured. It was a light flickering in the dark, a promise whispered in the cold, and a hope that made the nightmare bearable. Soldiers' love stories, woven into the tapestry of medieval life, remind us that even in the worst times, the human heart seeks connection, meaning, and home. The dawn creeps slowly over the misty hills. A village stirs to life. Children stretch and yawn, and somewhere a rooster begins its persistent crow. The world feels vast, uncertain, but quiet for a moment. It is here, between the ordinary and the extraordinary, that medieval love stories lived and breathed, imperfect, complicated, full of hope and heartache. We've wandered through crowded markets, shadowed chambers, battlefield tents, and festive halls, tracing the tangled paths of medieval romance. Along the way, we met lovers bound by duty and desire, warriors haunted by absence, widows carving out new lives, and secret sweethearts risking everything for a stolen kiss. It was a world where love was often perilous, always passionate, and never simple. Now, as the day begins, we can feel the echoes of those stories still resonating beneath the stones and soil. The laughter of a girl spinning wool, the whispered vows beneath a maypole, the letters folded into bundles and hidden in hay. All these moments remind us that love is both ancient and endlessly new. It's important to remember that medieval love was shaped by its time, by faith, law, social order, and survival. It wasn't perfect. It could be cruel, frustrating, and full of rules no modern heart would envy. But within those limits, people found joy, comfort, and sometimes something like freedom. So as you close your eyes tonight, think of the medieval lovers who dared to hope, who stitched their feelings into tapestries of poetry and song, who risked everything for a touch, a glance, a word. Their stories are not just history, they're reminders that love endures in all its messy, beautiful forms. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. End of script. Sweet dreams.